Hello everyone and welcome back to Shadow Man Stories. I can picture some of you already in bed, maybe some of you just getting home from work. Wherever you are, whatever time it is, I'm glad you're here. If this helps you relax or sleep, please like and subscribe. It means a lot. Now, let's get you comfortable, and I'll tell you tonight's story. My name is Margaret O'Sullivan, and I've been a park ranger for 15 years. People call me Maggie. I came to Alaska from Ireland when I was 24, looking for something bigger than the small village where I grew up. The Brooks Range and gates of the Arctic National Park became my home. It's wild up here, beautiful and dangerous in ways most people can't imagine. I specialize in wilderness navigation and Arctic survival training. That means when someone gets lost in 200,000 square miles of nothing, they call me. I've pulled climbers off frozen cliffs and tracked missing hikers through blizzards. The mountains don't scare me anymore. At least, they didn't until July of 1975. That summer was strange from the start. July in the Arctic Circle means 24 hours of daylight. The sun rolls around the sky like a lazy wheel, never quite setting. It should have been bright everywhere, all the time. But there were places, small spots at first, where shadows fell, without anything to cast them. I noticed it first near Midnight Peak, about 30 miles into the backcountry. I was leading a survival training course for new rangers when I saw a patch of darkness under a rocky outcrop. Nothing was blocking the sun. The shadow just sat there, black as winter night, in the middle of endless daylight. "Hey, Maggie," called Tom Winters, one of the trainees. He was a good kid from Montana, eager to learn. "What's that dark spot over there?" I walked closer, feeling something cold crawl up my spine. The shadow had sharp edges, like it was cut from black paper and laid on the ground. When I stuck my hand toward it, the air grew thick and cold. My fingers went numb. "Probably just a trick of the light," I said, pulling my hand back quickly. "The midnight sun can play games with your eyes." But I knew it wasn't that simple. I'd been in these mountains for 15 years. I knew every rock formation, every trick of light and shadow. This was something else. The Gwich'in people who lived in the villages had stories about things like this. They called them chi'ihwai, shadow beings that hunted when they shouldn't exist. Old Emetizia from Arctic Village had tried to warn me about them once. Years ago. I'd smiled politely and changed the subject. I believed in what I could see and touch and measure. I was wrong. We made camp that night near a small lake, the water mirror bright under the endless sun. The other rangers, Tom, Sarah Chen from California, and Big Jim Rodriguez from Texas, sat around our camp stove, sharing stories and coffee. Everything felt normal, the way it should, but I kept looking back toward that shadow under the rocks. It seemed larger now, spreading like spilled ink across the ground. And sometimes, when the wind was quiet, I thought I heard something moving in that darkness. "Maggie?" Sarah's voice snapped me back to the present. "You okay? You look like you've seen a ghost." I forced a smile. "Just tired. Tomorrow we'll head back toward the ranger station. This area is getting too unpredictable." I didn't tell them about the cold feeling in my chest, or how that shadow seemed to pulse like a living thing. I didn't mention that in all my years in the wilderness, I'd never felt watched the way I felt now. That night, I lay in my sleeping bag, listening to the others breathe. The tent glowed soft orange from the midnight sun outside. Everything should have been safe and warm and normal. But somewhere in the distance, I heard what sounded like whispers in the wind. Voices speaking in a language that seemed to bypass my ears and go straight into my bones, filling me with fear I couldn't name. I should have turned back then, should have radioed for evacuation and gotten everyone out of the mountains, but I'm stubborn, always have been. I thought I could handle whatever was out there. I was wrong about that too. The next morning brought our first real proof that something was terribly wrong. Tom was gone. I woke up at what would have been sunrise anywhere else, but here was just another hour of endless daylight. The tent felt too quiet. When I sat up, Tom's sleeping bag was empty, neatly arranged like he'd never been in it. "Tom?" I called softly, not wanting to wake the others. No answer. Sarah stirred in her bag. "What's wrong?" "Tom's not here. Probably just went to relieve himself." But his boots were still by the tent entrance. His jacket hung on a tree branch outside. Nobody goes wandering in the Arctic barefoot, not even to answer nature's call. Jim woke up when we started searching the camp. The three of us spread out, calling Tom's name, looking for footprints in the soft ground around the lake. We found his tracks leading down to the water's edge, then nothing. Just smooth sand and small stones, like someone had brushed away all signs of where he'd gone. "This doesn't make sense," Jim said, crouching by the water. "Tracks don't just disappear." That's when Sarah screamed. We spun around to see her pointing at the shadow under the rocks, the same one I'd noticed yesterday. It had grown during the night, spreading across 20 feet of ground in an impossible black stain. But that wasn't what made Sarah scream. Tom was standing in the middle of it. He stood perfectly still, arms at his sides, staring straight ahead. The shadow surrounded him like thick black water, but he wasn't wet. His skin looked pale, almost gray, and his eyes were completely black. "Tom!" I ran toward him, but stopped when I hit the edge of the shadow. The cold was like walking into a freezer, so sharp it burned. My breath came out in white puffs, even though the air temperature was 60 degrees. "Tom, can you hear me?" He turned his head slowly, like moving through thick syrup. When he looked at me, those black eyes held no recognition, no human warmth, nothing, but endless, hungry darkness. "Help me," he whispered, and his voice echoed strangely, like it was coming from somewhere very far away. "It's so cold here, Maggie. So cold and dark." I reached out, trying to grab his hand and pull him free. The moment my fingers touched the shadow, pain shot up my arm like electricity. The world tilted, and for just a second, I saw something impossible. I was standing in a place that wasn't a place, surrounded by towering walls of living darkness that writhed and whispered in voices that hurt to hear. Things moved in the black, shapes that might have been human once, but weren't anymore. They reached toward me with hands that had too many fingers, and their eyes were holes in reality, showing nothing but hungry void. "Maggie!" Jim's voice yanked me back. I was on the ground beside the shadow, my hand numb and white with cold. Jim and Sarah were pulling me away from the dark edge. When I looked up, Tom was gone. The shadow was smaller now, maybe 10 feet across, but it pulsed like a heartbeat, and somewhere in its depths, I could swear I heard Tom calling my name. "We need to get out of here," Sarah said, her voice shaking. "Right now, this place is wrong." "We can't leave Tom," I said, though every instinct I had was screaming at me to run. "That wasn't Tom," Jim said quietly. "I've seen enough dead men to know. Whatever that was, it wasn't human anymore." I wanted to argue, but deep down I knew he was right. The thing in the shadow had Tom's face and voice, but not his soul. Something had taken that away. We broke camp in 20 minutes, throwing gear into packs with hands that shook. I tried the radio, hoping to reach the ranger station, but got only static. The emergency beacon showed no signal. We were cut off, alone in the mountains with something that could steal people and wear their faces. As we hiked away from the lake, I looked back once. The shadow had grown again, spreading like a stain across the bright landscape. And standing at its edge, watching us leave, was a figure that might have been Tom. It waved goodbye with fingers that stretched too long. I didn't wave back. The shadows followed us. For 3 days, we hiked toward the ranger station, but the dark patches appeared everywhere we went. Small ones at first, circles of impossible night under rock, overhangs, or between trees. But they grew larger each day, and we started seeing things moving inside them. Sarah was the next to go missing. We'd made camp in a valley I knew well, one I'd used dozens of times before. Rocky walls on 3 sides, one way in and out, fresh water from a mountain stream. It should have been safe. I was on first watch when I heard her screaming. The sound came from everywhere at once, echoing off the valley walls like she was trapped in a cave. Jim and I grabbed our flashlights and ran toward her tent, but it was empty. Her sleeping bag was shredded, torn apart by something with very sharp claws. "Sarah," I called into the darkness. "Here," came her voice, weak and far away. "Down here." I followed the sound to a crack in the valley floor that I'd never noticed before. It was narrow, maybe 3 feet wide, dropping down into black nothing. Cold air flowed up from the depths, carrying a smell like old metal and decay. I fell. Sarah's voice drifted up from below. "I think my leg is broken. Can you get me out?" Jim appeared beside me with rope and climbing gear. "How deep?" he called down. "Maybe 30 feet. There's a ledge here, but... Her voice got strange, distant. Maggie, there are things down here, moving things. I clipped into the rope and started down. The walls of the crack were smooth, like they'd been melted rather than broken. My flashlight beam seemed to die just a few feet away, swallowed by darkness thicker than it should be. I found the ledge she'd mentioned, but Sarah wasn't there. Instead, I found her backpack, torn open and scattered. Her water bottle, cracked and empty. A few pieces of her torn clothing, and carved into the stone wall in letters that looked burned rather than cut. She is with us now. Sarah, I called into the deeper darkness below. Something answered, but it wasn't Sarah. It was a sound like wind through broken glass, like whispers in a language that predators might speak. And underneath it, barely audible, I heard Sarah crying. Not with pain, but with a despair so deep it made my bones ache. The rope jerked above me. Jim was pulling me up fast, shouting something I couldn't quite hear over the noise rising from below. I let him haul me to the surface, and we ran back to camp without looking at the crack again. But I could still hear Sarah calling my name as we packed our gear in the pale midnight light. By the fourth day, it was just Jim and me. He tried to stay strong, but I could see the fear in his eyes. We both knew we weren't going to make it to the ranger station. The shadows were everywhere now, covering whole sections of the mountainside. They moved when we weren't looking directly at them, flowing like spilled oil across the landscape, and we could see people in them. Tom and Sarah stood together in a shadow that stretched between two peaks, waving at us with movements that were almost right, but not quite. Their faces were too pale, their smiles too wide. When they called our names, their voices layered together in harmony no human throat could make. Don't look at them, I told Jim. Don't listen. But he was already slowing down, his head turning toward the shadow people. Jim, no. They look so sad, Maggie, he said, his voice dreamy. We should help them. I grabbed his arm, but he was stronger than me. He walked toward the nearest shadow like he was in a trance, and I couldn't stop him. At the dark edge, he paused and looked back at me. Tell my wife I tried to come home, he said in his own voice. Then he stepped into the darkness and was gone. Now it was just me, alone in the mountains, with shadows that moved on their own and dead friends who wanted me to join them. I had maybe a day's worth of food and water left. The radio still gave only static. My GPS showed impossible readings, locations that put me hundreds of miles from where I should be. The sun rolled around the sky in its endless circle, but somehow there was darkness everywhere. I made a decision. Instead of running toward the ranger station, I turned back toward Midnight Peak, where this had all started. If these things had come from somewhere, maybe I could find a way to send them back. Maybe I could save my friends, or maybe I was just tired of running. As I climbed higher into the mountains, the shadows grew thicker and the whispers grew louder. Behind me, following at a distance I could feel but not measure, came the pale figures of Tom and Sarah and Jim, walking in perfect silent step, waiting for me to get tired enough to join them. The source was at the top of Midnight Peak. I climbed for 6 hours through terrain that shifted when I wasn't looking directly at it. Paths appeared and disappeared. Rocky ledges moved like living things. The whispers in the shadows grew so loud they almost drowned out my own thoughts. At the summit, I found a camp. Not recent, this was old, maybe decades. Canvas tents rotted by weather and time. Rusted equipment scattered across the rocks. But in the center of it all was something that shouldn't have been there. A perfect circle of absolute darkness, maybe 20 feet across. Not shadow. This was the complete absence of light, so black it hurt to look at. The air above it shimmered like heat waves, and I could hear sounds from inside, voices speaking in that glass whisper language, and underneath them, human voices calling for help. Dozens of them. Maybe hundreds. An old journal lay beside one of the collapsed tents, its pages yellow and brittle. I recognized the handwriting from old ranger reports. Jack Morrison, who disappeared in 1961 while researching Gwich'in folklore. The final entry was dated July 15th, 1961. Asterisk. The Gwich'in elders were right. The Chihuahua are real, beings from a place that exists between light and dark, feeding on fear and life force. They've been trapped in their shadow realm for centuries, but the barrier is weakening. They need human hosts to anchor themselves in our world. Asterisk, asterisk. I've seen what they do to people. They don't kill, they transform, turning humans into shadow bridges between dimensions. Once they have enough bridges, they can bring their entire realm through. Asterisk, asterisk. The portal at the peak is growing. If it reaches full size, they'll pour through like water through a broken dam. Nothing will stop them then. Asterisk, asterisk. I'm going to try to close it. If I fail, if someone finds this journal, the only thing that hurts them is direct light. Real light, not the pale midnight sun. And mirrors. They can't exist in perfect reflection. Asterisk, asterisk. God help whoever reads this. God help us all. Asterisk. The journal ended there. I looked up from the pages to find I wasn't alone anymore. Tom, Sarah, and Jim stood at the edge of the circle, their pale faces sad and hungry. Behind them came others, people in old-fashioned clothes who must have been missing for decades. All of them moving in that perfect silent step, all with those endless black eyes. "Join us, Maggie," Tom said, his voice echoing from somewhere far away. "It doesn't hurt. You just let go." "We're happy here," Sarah added. "No pain, no fear. Just peace." "Your friends need you," Jim whispered. They began walking toward me, slow and steady. I backed away, but there was nowhere to go. The circle of darkness was behind me, radiating cold that made my bones ache. The shadow people were in front of me, reaching out with 2 long fingers. That's when I remembered my signal mirror. Every wilderness ranger carries one, a small mirror designed to flash sunlight for rescue signals. I'd had mine for 15 years, polished metal that threw back light like a weapon. I pulled it from my pack as the shadow people got closer. The midnight sun was dim and pale, but when I angled the mirror right, it caught the light and threw it back in a brilliant flash. The effect was immediate. The shadow people screamed, not with voices, but with a sound like breaking glass. They scattered backward, their forms wavering like smoke. For just a moment, I saw them as they really were, not my friends, but writhing shapes of living darkness wearing stolen faces like masks. I kept the light moving, sweeping the mirror back and forth. Where the reflected sunlight hit them, they became transparent. Where it hit the black circle, the darkness actually bubbled and steamed. But the mirror was small, and I was just one person. There were dozens of them, and they were getting braver, learning to move around the light beam. That's when I realized what I had to do. I turned toward the circle of darkness and held up the mirror, angling it to catch the sun. The reflected light hit the portal dead center, and the air exploded with that glass-breaking scream. The darkness writhed and shrank, fighting the light like a living thing. But one small mirror wasn't enough. "Help me," I shouted to the shadow people. "If you're really my friends, if any part of you is still human, help me close this thing." For a moment, nothing happened. Then Tom stepped forward, his black eyes flickering. "Maggie?" His voice was different now, confused, scared, but recognizably human. "Tom, I need you to find anything reflective. Mirrors, metal, anything that can throw light." He nodded and stumbled toward the old camp. The other shadow people watched us, uncertain. Some flickered between their dark forms and more human shapes, as if they were fighting an internal war. Tom came back with pieces of polished metal from the old equipment, a steel pot, a broken compass, bits of machinery. I showed him how to angle them to catch the sun, and slowly we built a wall of reflected light. The portal shrieked and contracted. Sarah joined us next, then Jim, then others I didn't recognize. Decades of missing people, finding enough of themselves to fight back. We surrounded the circle with mirrors and metal, throwing concentrated sunlight at the darkness from every angle. The portal collapsed like a punctured balloon, folding in on itself with a sound like the world tearing. For a moment, I thought we'd won. Then the ground started shaking. The mountain was coming apart. Closing the portal had torn something fundamental in the rock itself. Cracks spread across the summit like lightning, and I could hear rumbling from deep inside the peak. Steam hissed from the cracks, and the air filled with the smell of sulfur. "Run!" I shouted to the others, but when I turned around, they were gone. All of them, Tom, Sarah, Jim, the decades of missing people, gone like smoke in the wind. Only their voices remained, whispers in the air that might have been thank you, or might have been goodbye. I ran down the mountain as it shook itself apart behind me. Rocks bigger than cars tumbled past me, and chasms opened in the trail, but the shadows were gone. All of them. The midnight sun seemed brighter somehow, more real. It took me 2 days to reach the ranger station, hiking through terrain that had returned to normal. My radio started working again on the second day, and I called in the situation: 3 missing rangers, a geological event at midnight peak, need for search and rescue. I didn't mention the shadows or the portal or the things that lived between light and dark. Who would believe that? The official report listed Tom, Sarah, and Jim as victims of a landslide caused by unstable geological conditions. Their bodies were never found, which wasn't unusual in the Brooks Range. The mountains keep their dead. I stayed on as a ranger for another 5 years, until my nerves finally gave out. Every shadow made me jump. Every patch of darkness without an obvious source sent me reaching for my signal mirror. I started carrying 3 mirrors, then 5, then a whole belt full of reflective metal. The other rangers thought I'd developed some kind of obsession. They weren't wrong. I moved to Anchorage in 1980 and took a job with the Forest Service, working in an office with big windows and bright lights. I married a good man who didn't ask too many questions about why I needed every room in our house to have multiple light sources. But sometimes, on the darkest winter nights, I catch glimpses of movement in shadows that shouldn't exist. Shapes that might be people walking just outside my vision. And sometimes, I hear voices calling my name in a language that bypasses the ears and goes straight to the bones. The portal is closed, but I don't think the Chihuahua are gone completely. They're still out there, in the spaces between light and dark, looking for new ways through. Every summer, people go missing in the Brooks Range. Hikers, climbers, researchers studying the midnight sun. The official explanations are always reasonable. Bear attacks, falls, exposure, getting lost in the wilderness. I know better. I keep my mirrors polished and my story to myself. Because some truths are too dangerous to share, and some darkness is too hungry to risk feeding with attention. But I'm writing this down now, 30 years later, because I'm old and my hands shake and I won't be able to hold a mirror steady much longer. Someone needs to know. Someone needs to be ready. If you ever find yourself in the Brooks Range during the midnight sun, and you see shadows that exist without something to cast them, turn around, leave immediately. Don't try to help anyone you find standing in those shadows, no matter how much they look like people you know. And whatever you do, don't listen to them when they call your name. They remember mine, even now. Sometimes, in the deepest part of winter, when the darkness in Anchorage seems to last forever, I hear Tom and Sarah and Jim whispering to me from the shadows under my porch light. Their voices are kind and sad and endlessly patient. They're still waiting for me to join them. Someday, when I'm too tired to fight anymore, maybe I will. But not today. Today, I keep my mirrors close and my lights bright, and I remember that some doors, once closed, should never be opened again. Even by the people we love. My name is Thomas Brightfeather, but everyone calls me Tom. I've been a ranger in Alaska's wilderness for 16 years now, and I thought I'd seen everything these frozen lands could throw at a man. I was wrong. It was March 1978, and I was stationed at Anuktuvuk Pass in the Arctic National Wildlife Refuge. Most people don't know this place exists. It's just a remote mountain pass in the Brooks Range, sitting at 2,200 feet above sea level. The nearest real town is Fairbanks, and that's 250 miles south. When winter storms hit, you're on your own. My job was tracking the porcupine caribou herd. These animals have been making the same migration for thousands of years, following routes that my grandfather's grandfather knew by heart. I'm half Inupiaq, and my people have lived with these caribou since time began. My grandfather used to tell me stories about the old days, about spirits that walked the ice. Back then, I thought they were just stories. The research team had been out there for 2 weeks, studying how climate change was affecting the caribou's behavior. Dr. Sarah Chen was the lead scientist, a tough woman from California who didn't seem to feel the cold. With her were Dr. Mark Rodriguez, a climate specialist, and Dr. Lisa Park, who studied animal behavior. They'd set up camp near the calving grounds, where the female caribou give birth to their young. Everything was normal until the storm hit. I remember the morning clearly. The radio crackled to life just as I was drinking my coffee. It was Dr. Chen's voice, but she sounded different. Scared. "Base camp, this is Research Team Alpha. We've got a situation here." "Go ahead, Alpha," I replied, setting down my cup. Outside my cabin, the wind was picking up. Dark clouds were rolling in from the north. "Something's been following the herd. We found tracks this morning. They're huge, bigger than any grizzly bear I've ever seen. But they're the wrong shape. It looks like something with multiple legs." I frowned. "Could be a wolf pack. The snow can make tracks look strange." "Tom, I've been studying Arctic animals for 10 years. This isn't a wolf. The tracks are 18 inches across, and they're arranged in pairs, like sled runners. There are 8 or 10 distinct pad marks in each print." The radio went quiet for a moment. In the background, I could hear the wind getting stronger. "Alpha, you need to pack up and head back. Weather Service is calling for a major storm. Temperatures could drop to -40. "We're not done with our research," Dr. Rodriguez's voice came through. "We need another week at least." "Listen to me," I said, looking at my weather instruments. The barometric pressure was dropping fast. "This isn't California weather. This storm could last for days. You could die out there." There was static, then Dr. Chen again. "Tom, there's something else. The caribou are acting strange. They keep looking over their shoulders, like something's hunting them. The mothers are keeping their calves close. I've never seen them this nervous." That's when the first real gust of wind hit my cabin, rattling the windows. I looked outside and saw snow beginning to fall. Thick, heavy flakes that meant business. "Alpha, I'm ordering you back to base. Leave your equipment if you have to. That storm's going to be a killer." The radio crackled with static. "Tom, can barely hear you. Storm's getting." Then nothing. I tried calling back for an hour, but the storm had knocked out communications. The wind was howling now, and snow was piling up against my windows. In 16 years as a ranger, I'd seen storms that could bury a truck in an hour. This one felt different. Angrier, somehow. I spent the rest of the day preparing my emergency gear. If the research team was in trouble, I'd have to go after them once the storm passed. But deep in my gut, something felt wrong. It wasn't just the weather. That night, as the wind screamed outside my cabin, I remembered my grandfather's stories. He used to tell me about the Kokogiak, ancient ice bears with 8 legs that hunted humans during the worst storms. "They feed on warmth," he'd say, his old eyes serious. "They take the heat right out of your body, leave you frozen but alive, saving you for later." I'd always thought those were just old legends, stories to keep children close to home during winter. But lying in my bunk, listening to the storm tear at my cabin, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was out there in the blizzard. Something that had found 3 scientists camping alone in the wilderness. Something that was very, very hungry. The storm lasted 3 days. 3 days of wind that sounded like screaming voices and snow that came down so thick you couldn't see your hand in front of your face. I'd lived through Arctic storms before, but this one felt personal, like it had a mind of its own. When it finally cleared on the 4th morning, the silence was deafening. No wind, no sound at all, just endless white in every direction. I fired up my snowmobile and headed out to find the research team. The ride to their last known position took 2 hours. The snow was deep, but my machine cut through it well enough. What bothered me was the quiet. Usually, you'd hear ravens or Arctic foxes, maybe the distant call of caribou, but there was nothing. Even the engine of my snowmobile seemed muffled, like the snow was swallowing all sound. I found their camp just before noon. 3 bright orange tents arranged in a perfect circle, exactly as they'd been trained to set up. But something was wrong. The tents were covered in thick ice, as if they'd been frozen from the inside, and there were no tracks leading away from the camp. No sign that anyone had left. I called out as I approached, "Dr. Chen? Dr. Rodriguez? Anyone there?" No answer. The first tent belonged to Dr. Chen. I unzipped the entrance and peered inside. Her sleeping bag was there, her clothes, her research notes, everything neat and organized. But no Dr. Chen. The inside of the tent was coated with ice crystals, and the temperature felt even colder than outside. The second tent was the same. Dr. Rodriguez's gear was all there, but no sign of him. The third tent was Dr. Park's, and it was empty too. But in this one, I found something that made my blood run cold. Her video camera was still running. I picked it up with numb fingers and rewound the tape. The last recording was from 3 nights ago, during the storm. Doctor, Park's face appeared on the small screen, pale and frightened. It's the second night of the storm, she was saying, glancing nervously at the tent walls. We're hearing things outside, footsteps in the snow, but they don't sound right, too heavy, too rhythmic, like something big is walking around our camp. The video shook as wind hit the tent. In the mode, background, I could hear a sound that made my skin crawl, a low rumbling like a giant cat purring. Sarah thinks we should stay put until morning. Dr. Park continued. But Mark wants to check outside. I don't think that's a good idea. Something feels wrong. The caribou ran away yesterday, all of them at once. They looked terrified. Suddenly, the tent wall bulged inward, as if something massive was pressing against it from outside. Dr. Park gasped, and the camera shook violently. "Oh God," she whispered. "It's right outside. I can see its shadow through the tent wall. It's huge, and it's got too many legs. That's impossible. Bears don't have 8 legs. Bears don't." The video cut to static. I rewound it and watched again. When the tent wall bulged, I could definitely see a shadow. Something the size of a polar bear. But the silhouette was all wrong. The legs were too numerous, positioned like a giant spider's. I put the camera in my pack and stepped outside. That's when I saw the tracks. They circled the camp in a wide ring, and Dr. Chen had been right. They were unlike anything I'd ever seen. Each print was nearly 2 feet across, with 8 distinct pad marks arranged in pairs. The depth suggested something incredibly heavy, but the spacing between prints was too wide for any normal animal. Whatever made these tracks had been moving with impossible grace across the snow. I followed the trail for about 50 yards before it just stopped. Not like the animal had walked away in a different direction. The tracks simply ended, as if whatever made them had vanished into thin air. That's when I heard it, the same low rumbling sound from Dr. Park's video. It seemed to come from everywhere at once, vibrating up through the snow and into my bones. I spun around, looking for the source, but saw nothing but empty white landscape. The sound stopped as suddenly as it had started. I keyed my radio, hoping the storm hadn't damaged the equipment back at base. "Base camp, this is Brightfeather. I need immediate backup at the research site. The team is missing, and we have unusual circumstances." Static answered me. I tried again, adjusting the frequency. Nothing. Either the storm had knocked out communications, or something was jamming the signal. That's when the temperature dropped. I don't mean it got a little cooler. I mean the temperature plummeted 20 degrees in about 10 seconds. My breath started coming out in thick clouds, and I could feel the moisture in my nose beginning to freeze. This wasn't natural weather. This was something else. Behind me, I heard the soft whisper of something large moving through snow. I turned slowly, my hand moving to the rifle on my back. About 100 yards away, barely visible against the white landscape, something was watching me. It was pale, massive, and definitely not a polar bear. For just a moment, I saw it clearly, a creature the size of a small truck, covered in thick white fur, standing on 8 powerful legs. But the strangest thing was its eyes. They glowed with a cold blue light, like the heart of a glacier. We stared at each other for what felt like forever. Then, without moving its legs, the creature began to sink into the snow. Not like it was digging or burrowing, just sinking, as if the ground was becoming liquid beneath it. In seconds, it was gone. I stood there for a long time, trying to convince myself I'd imagined it. Hypothermia can cause hallucinations. Stress can make you see things. But the tracks were real. The missing scientists were real. And somewhere deep in my bones, I could still feel that rumbling sound. I climbed back on my snowmobile and started the engine. Whatever had happened to the research team, I wasn't going to figure it out standing in the open. I needed help, equipment, and probably a lot more ammunition. As I rode away from the empty camp, I kept looking over my shoulder. The white landscape looked normal now, peaceful even, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something was following me, staying just out of sight, watching my every move. That night, back in my cabin, I pulled out my grandfather's journal. He'd written down many of the old stories, including detailed accounts of the Kokogiak. According to the legends, they appeared during the worst storms, when the barrier between worlds was thin. They fed on human warmth, but they didn't kill quickly. They kept their prey alive, frozen but conscious, saving them for when the hunger grew too strong. I read until dawn, and by morning, I knew two things for certain. My grandfather's stories weren't legends, and somewhere out in the frozen wilderness, 3 people were still alive but wishing they weren't. Help arrived the next afternoon in the form of Jake Morrison, another ranger from the Fairbanks district. Jake was a good man, steady, experienced, and not easily rattled. I'd specifically asked for him because I knew he wouldn't panic when I told him what I'd seen. "So let me get this straight," Jake said as we prepared our gear. "You think this thing is some kind of supernatural ice bear with 8 legs? I think something took 3 scientists, and the tracks don't match any known animal," I replied carefully. "Whatever it is, it's dangerous, and it's still out there." Jake nodded, checking his rifle. "Fair enough. Weird things happen in the wilderness. I once tracked what I thought was a pack of wolves for 3 days, only to find out it was one injured grizzly walking in circles." But I could see the doubt in his eyes. He thought the isolation was getting to me. We set out at first light, taking Jake's helicopter to cover more ground. From the air, the landscape looked even more desolate, endless white broken only by the dark line of the mountain pass. We flew in expanding circles, looking for any sign of the missing team. It was Jake who spotted the first body. "Down there," he said, pointing toward a cluster of ice formations about 5 miles from the original camp. "Something orange in that cave." We landed nearby and approached on foot. The cave was shallow, carved into a hillside by centuries of wind and water. Inside, we found Dr. Sarah Chen. She was alive. That should have been good news. But it wasn't. Dr. Chen was sitting upright against the back wall of the cave, her eyes open, breathing slowly. But when I checked her pulse, her skin was ice cold. Her core temperature should have killed her hours ago, but somehow she was still conscious. "Dr. Chen?" I called gently. "Sarah, can you hear me?" Her eyes moved to focus on my face, but she didn't speak. She couldn't speak. Her lips and tongue were frozen solid. But her eyes were terrified and very much alive. "Jesus," Jake whispered. "How is she still breathing?" I checked her over carefully. No visible injuries, no signs of violence. But her body temperature was so low that by all medical knowledge, she should have been dead. It was like something was keeping her alive artificially, preserving her at the edge of death. "We need to get her to a hospital," Jake said, reaching for her. "Wait." I grabbed his arm. "Look at the cave walls. The ice formations weren't natural. They formed perfect spirals and geometric patterns, too precise to be created by wind or water. And in the deepest part of the cave, carved into the ice itself, were symbols that I recognized from my grandfather's journal. Ancient Inupiaq, markings used to bind spirits. "This is a feeding cache," I said quietly. "She's not here by accident. Something put her here." That's when we heard the rumbling. It started low and distant, but quickly grew closer. The ice formations in the cave began to vibrate, creating a haunting musical sound. Jake grabbed his rifle, and we both moved toward the cave entrance. Outside, the world had changed. What had been clear skies moments before was now filled with swirling snow, even though there was no wind. The snow moved in patterns, forming spirals and walls that seemed to close in around us. "The helicopter," Jake said. But when we looked toward where we'd landed, our aircraft was gone. Not destroyed or moved, simply gone, as if it had never existed. That's when I saw them. 3 shapes moved through the swirling snow, each one massive and pale. They didn't walk like normal animals. Instead, they seemed to flow over the snow, their 8 legs moving in perfect coordination. As they got closer, I could see their eyes, cold blue lights that cut through the supernatural storm. "My God," Jake breathed. "What are those things?" "Kokogiak," I said, remembering my grandfather's words. "Ice walkers. They hunt during storms, feed on human warmth." The largest of the 3 creatures stopped about 50 feet away. When it spoke, the voice was like breaking glaciers, deep and ancient. "You have come for the warm ones?" It said in a dialect of Inupiaq, so old I barely understood it. "They are ours now. Their heat feeds us through the long cold." "Where are the other 2? I called back in English, hoping it would understand. "Safe in the ice, as this one will be safe. As you will be safe when your warmth joins ours." The creature began to move toward us, its 8 legs carrying it across the snow with impossible grace. Behind it, the other 2 Kokogiaks spread out to surround the cave. I pulled out my grandfather's seal oil lamp, one of the few things I'd brought from the old traditions. My hands were shaking, but I managed to light it with a waterproof match. The moment the flame appeared, all 3 creatures stopped moving. The blue light in their eyes flickered, and the largest one let out a sound like ice cracking under pressure. "The old fires," it hissed. "The binding. Flames. You carry the blood of the shamans." "I carry the blood of the Inupiaq people," I said, holding the lamp higher. "And you don't belong in this world." But even as I spoke, I could see more shapes moving in the snow. The 3 in front of us weren't alone. There were others, maybe a dozen, circling through the storm like a pack of wolves. Jake had gone pale beside me. "Tom, there are too many of them. Even if that lamp thing works, we can't fight them all." He was right. We were outnumbered and surrounded, trapped in a cave with a victim who couldn't be moved. And somewhere out in the supernatural storm, 2 more scientists were waiting in ice caches, kept alive for the creature's convenience. The largest Kokogiak spoke again, and this time its voice was closer to human speech. "Give us the warm one behind you, and we will make your deaths quick. Fight us, and you will join our preserved ones, alive in the ice until the world ends." I looked at Dr. Chen, sitting motionless against the cave wall, her terrified eyes the only sign of life left in her frozen body. Then I looked at Jake, who was checking his ammunition with the grim expression of a man who knew he was about to die. The storm was getting stronger, and the circle of blue eyes was getting closer. Whatever I was going to do, it had to be now. I reached into my pack and pulled out my grandfather's journal, opening it to a page covered with protection symbols and ancient words. I'd memorized these chants as a child, never thinking I'd need them. But as I began to speak the old words, my grandfather's voice seemed to echo in my mind, and for the first time since finding the empty camp, I felt hope. The Kokogiak might be ancient and powerful, but they weren't the only old things in this wilderness. The spirits of my ancestors had fought these creatures before, and they'd won. The question was, would they help me? The ancient words felt strange in my mouth, like speaking a half-remembered language from childhood dreams. But as I chanted the protection ritual my grandfather had taught me, something began to change in the cave. The seal oil flame grew brighter, casting dancing shadows on the ice walls. The geometric patterns carved into the ice started to glow with a warm, golden light. And for just a moment, I could swear I felt my grandfather's presence standing beside me. The Kokogiak reacted immediately. The largest one reared back on its hind legs, revealing a body that was both bear-like and wrong. Too long, too angular, with fur that seemed to shift between white and translucent. Its roar shook the cave, sending chunks of ice crashing down around us. "The blood remembers," it snarled in its broken English. "But blood alone is not enough, shaman's child. You are weak, untrained, your ancestors' power fades." As if to prove its point, the creature gestured with one massive paw. Instantly, the temperature in the cave dropped, another 30 degrees. Jake's breath became visible in thick clouds, and frost began forming on our gear. "Jake," I said through chattering teeth, "when I give the word, grab Dr. Chen and run for that outcropping of rocks to the north. Don't look back. What about you? Someone has to hold them off." But before Jake could argue, we heard new sounds from deeper in the cave system. Human voices, weak but alive. Dr. Rodriguez and Dr. Park were here somewhere, probably in ice caches like the one Dr. Chen had been placed in. They're all here, I realized. This whole cave system is a feeding ground. The largest Kokogiak tilted its massive head, and I saw something that chilled me more than the supernatural cold: intelligence. This wasn't just a predator. It was thinking, planning. "You understand now?" it said. "We do not simply hunt, we preserve. Your kind has brought change to the ice, disrupted the old patterns. The world grows warm, and we grow hungry. So we adapt." Another gesture, and the storm outside intensified. Through the swirling snow, I caught glimpses of more caves, more ice formations. This wasn't just a feeding ground, it was a storage facility. How many people had the Kokogiak taken over the years? How many victims were frozen alive in these caves, waiting to be consumed? Your scientists study the changing ice, the creature continued. They do not understand that some changes wake things that should sleep forever. We were the guardians once, keeping the balance. Now we are the hungry ones, and the hunger never ends. That's when I understood. These weren't just monsters from old legends. They were something else. Guardians turned predator, protectors corrupted by the very changes they once fought against. You were shamans once, I said, the realization hitting me like a physical blow. Human shamans who bound themselves to the ice spirits. The creature's blue eyes flickered. Clever child, yes, we were your people once. We chose the binding, accepted the transformation to protect the balance. But the balance is broken now, and we are broken with it. Behind the creature, I could see the others moving closer. But something else was happening too. The northern lights were beginning to appear in the sky above the cave, even though it was the middle of the day. Bands of green and blue light danced across the storm clouds, and with them came a feeling of presence. Not malevolent like the Kokogiak, but ancient and watchful. The ancestors come, Jake whispered, staring at the lights. He was right. I could feel them now, generations of Inupiaq spirits, drawn by the old words and the seal oil flame. My grandfather's voice was strongest among them, but there were others too. Shamans and hunters and mothers who had fought to protect their people from threats both natural and supernatural. The largest Kokogiak sensed them too. Its head swiveled upward, and for the first time, it looked uncertain. They cannot help you, it said. But there was doubt in its voice. We are bound to the ice itself. We are part of this land now. So are they, I replied, feeling strength flow into me from the gathering spirits. And they were here first. I began the banishment ritual, words I'd only heard once before when my grandfather had driven off something that had been stalking our village. The seal oil flame blazed higher, and the golden light from the ice carvings grew so bright it was almost blinding. The Kokogiak pack howled in unison, a sound like breaking glaciers and howling wind. They rushed toward the cave entrance, all pretense of patience gone. But as they crossed into the golden light, their forms began to waver and blur, as if they were melting. The largest one fought against the banishment, its massive form solidifying and dispersing with each word I spoke. You cannot send us back. We are needed here. The ice needs guardians. The ice has guardians, I said, feeling my grandfather's hand on my shoulder, feeling the presence of every ancestor who had ever stood against the darkness. But you're not them anymore. You're just hungry. With the final word of the banishment, the golden light exploded outward from the cave. The Kokogiak pack dissolved into mist and snow, their howls fading into the wind. The supernatural storm died away, leaving only natural sunlight and the peaceful silence of the Arctic. I rushed to Dr. Chen, checking her pulse. It was weak but steady, and her body temperature was slowly beginning to rise. Jake was already moving deeper into the cave system, following the sounds of the other survivors. Tom, he called. I found them. They're alive but really cold. We need to get them warm fast. As I helped carry the 3 scientists out of the caves, I looked up at the fading northern lights. The ancestors were departing, their work done, but I could still feel their approval. The balance had been restored, at least for now. But as we loaded the survivors into the rescue helicopter that appeared overhead just as the banishment finished, I couldn't shake the feeling that this wasn't over. The Kokogiak had spoken of changes, of disruptions to the old patterns. Climate change was real, and it was waking things that had slept in the ice for thousands of years. We'd won this battle, but there would be others. The world was changing, and not everything that emerged from the melting ice would be friendly. The official report listed it as a case of severe hypothermia brought on by exposure during an unexpected storm. All 3 scientists recovered fully, though they had no memory of their time in the ice caves. The doctors called it trauma-induced amnesia, and I didn't correct them. Dr. Chen, Dr. Rodriguez, and Dr. Park were flown to Anchorage for treatment. Within a week, they were back to their normal lives, continuing their climate research. None of them remembered the Kokogiak, the supernatural storm, or their time as living ice sculptures. Sometimes trauma does that. The mind protects itself by forgetting. Jake and I never talked about what we'd seen. There's an unspoken rule among people who work in remote places. Some stories don't get told. Some truths are too strange for the outside world. But I know Jake remembers every detail, just like I do. Sometimes I catch him looking at the horizon during winter storms, watching for shapes that shouldn't be there. I kept my grandfather's journal and added my own entries. The Kokogiak had been banished, but they hadn't been destroyed. They were part of the ice itself now, and as long as there was ice in Alaska, they would exist somewhere in the spaces between real and unreal. What worried me more were the creature's words about change and disruption. Over the following months, I started tracking unusual incidents across Alaska, hunting parties that disappeared without trace, researchers who reported impossible animal behavior, entire villages that went dark during winter storms only to return to normal with no memory of what had happened. The patterns were spreading. I began working more closely with the tribal elders, learning protection rituals that had been passed down for generations. The old knowledge was still out there, kept alive by people who understood that some things in the wilderness were older and stranger than science could explain. 3 years later, I was promoted to chief ranger for the entire Brooks Range region. I used my new authority to establish what I called cultural liaison protocols, regular consultations with indigenous communities about unusual wildlife behavior. On paper, it looked like progressive environmental policy. In reality, it was an early warning system for supernatural activity. The climate kept changing, and the ice kept melting. Every spring brought new reports of strange tracks, unusual animal behavior, and unexplained disappearances. Most could be explained by normal causes, but not all. I investigated each case personally, carrying my grandfather's seal oil lamp and the protection chants that had saved my life. Some things I could handle alone. Others required help from the tribal shamans, the few who still remembered the old ways. We developed a quiet network of people who understood that Alaska's wilderness held more than just bears and wolves. The hardest part was the isolation. I couldn't tell my family what I'd seen, couldn't share the burden with friends who wouldn't understand. But I had to keep watching, keep protecting people who would never know how much danger they were in. On cold nights, when the aurora borealis dances across the sky, I sometimes feel my grandfather's presence. He's proud of me, I think. Proud that I'm carrying on the old responsibilities, keeping the balance between worlds, but he's also worried. We all are. The ice is melting faster every year, and with each cubic mile of ancient permafrost that disappears, something else might wake up. The Kokogiak were just the beginning. There are older things sleeping in the deep ice, things that have been frozen since before humans walked the earth. Climate change isn't just about rising sea levels and changing weather patterns. It's about awakening an entire world that was meant to stay buried. I'm 53 now, and I've trained 3 younger rangers in what I call wilderness awareness protocols. They don't know the whole truth yet, but they're learning to recognize the signs, to spot the patterns that mark supernatural activity. When I retire, they'll take over the watch. Because someone has to watch, someone has to be ready when the next storm comes. When the next ancient thing crawls out of the melting ice and decides that humans look like good eating. My grandfather used to say that every generation produces those who stand between the everyday world and the hungry dark. For my generation, in my little corner of Alaska, that someone turned out to be me. I just hope I'm enough. My name is Michael Ironcloud, and I've been a ranger at Denali National Park for 18 years. People call me Mike. Before this job, I spent 12 years as an Alaska State Trooper, so I thought I'd seen everything the wilderness could throw at me. Bears, wolves, drunk hunters, lost tourists, you name it. I was wrong. It was September 1989, and the first snow had already dusted the peaks around Wonder Lake. The nights were getting longer, and soon we'd have months of darkness ahead. I was stationed at the remote Wonder Lake Ranger Station, about 85 miles into the backcountry. No phones, no radio contact most days. Just me, the wilderness, and whatever problems came my way. That morning started like any other. I was drinking coffee and checking my equipment when I heard the sound of an engine struggling up the dirt road. A green pickup truck pulled up, and Dr. Sarah Mitchell from the University Research Station climbed out. She looked rattled, which was unusual. "Sarah, had been studying wolves in the park for 5 years and wasn't easily spooked. "Mike, we need to talk," she said, not even waiting for me to invite her inside. "Something attacked our station last night." I poured her coffee and sat down. "Bears getting into your food again?" "No," she shook her head hard. "This was wolves. But Mike, they weren't acting like any wolves I've ever seen. I'd dealt with problem wolves before. Sometimes a pack would get too comfortable around humans and need to be relocated." "What happened exactly?" Sarah wrapped her hands around the coffee mug. "They came right up to our cabins, coordinated, like they had a plan. 3 of my people got hurt trying to get from the lab to the main building. The wolves surrounded them, cut off their escape routes." That did sound strange. Wolves usually avoided human contact, especially groups of people. "How many wolves?" "At least 6, maybe 8. It was dark, and they moved fast." She paused. "Mike, they walked on their back legs. I know how that sounds, but I saw it. They stood up like people." I kept my face neutral. Fear and darkness could make people see all sorts of things. "Injuries serious?" "Tom needed 15 stitches on his arm. Jenny has deep scratches on her back. And Carlos," she trailed off. The bite pattern on Carlos's shoulder. "Mike, I've studied wolf anatomy for years. These bite marks are too big, too wide. Like the jaw was bigger than any wolf I've measured." After Sarah left, I loaded my truck with tracking gear and drove to the research station. The building sat in a clearing beside a small lake, surrounded by spruce and birch trees. I could see the damage right away: torn screens, scattered equipment, deep scratches in the wooden walls. The tracks told a story that made my skin crawl. I'd tracked wolves across Alaska for 2 decades, and these prints started normal enough: 4 pads, claws, the right size. But then, about 50 yards from the buildings, they changed. The front paws became longer, more like hands. The back paws showed heel strikes, like something walking upright. I followed the trail into the woods. Every 100 yards or so, the tracks would shift from 4-legged to 2-legged and back again. It was impossible, but the evidence was right there in the soft earth. As the sun set behind the mountains, I felt something I hadn't experienced since my first week as a trooper 20 years ago: the cold certainty that I was in over my head. The next morning brought news that made my blood run cold. 2 backcountry photographers had been attacked during the night, about 10 miles south of the research station. One was dead. I drove to the scene with Jim Torres, another ranger who'd come up from headquarters. We'd worked together for 8 years, and I trusted his judgment. The campsite looked like a war zone. "Jesus," Jim whispered, looking at the torn tent and scattered gear. "What kind of animal does this?" The victim was a man named David Chen, maybe 35 years old. We found him near the remnants of his tent, and I had to look away. The wounds were savage but precise. Too precise. Someone or something had arranged his body in a specific way. Arms crossed, facing east toward the mountains. "Ritualistic," Jim said quietly. "Like it means something." The survivor, a woman named Lisa Park, was barely coherent. The medics had given her something for shock, but she kept grabbing my arm and repeating the same words. "They stood up, Mike." They stood up and looked at us like they were thinking. I found tracks around the campsite that matched the ones from the research station. But these were clearer, pressed deep into the mud near the lake shore. I called Jim over to look. "That's a human footprint," he said, pointing to a clear impression. "But look at the toes. Too long. And are those claws?" We followed the trail for 2 miles before it disappeared onto rocky ground. But we found something else that made us both stop and stare. Hanging from a low branch was David Chen's camera, completely undamaged. The film inside showed normal wildlife photos until the last few frames. The final picture was taken from inside the tent, looking out. In the image, silhouetted against the night sky, stood a creature that walked on 2 legs, but had the head and body shape of a massive wolf. Its eyes reflected the camera flash like mirrors. "Could be doctored," Jim said, but his voice lacked conviction. That afternoon, we returned to the research station to interview the injured researchers. Tom Bradley showed me his arm wound, 4 deep punctures that were healing remarkably fast. "It grabbed me," Tom said. "Not bit, grabbed. With its front paws. But they felt like hands, Mike. Fingers and thumbs. Jenny Morrison had scratches across her back that looked like claw marks, but they were too organized, too deliberate. "It could have killed me," she said. "I was down, couldn't move, and it just stood over me for maybe 10 seconds. Then it made this sound, like a growl mixed with words. Like it was talking to the others." Carlos Vega's shoulder wound was the most disturbing. The bite pattern showed canine teeth, but the jaw span was nearly 8 inches, twice the size of the largest wolf on record. "They were hunting us," Carlos said. "Not like animals hunt, but like people hunt. They had a plan, cut off our escape routes, work together. The big one, the leader, it looked right at me before it bit down. I swear it smiled." That night, I sat in my cabin cleaning my rifle and thinking about what I'd seen. 18 years in these mountains, and I'd never encountered anything like this. The tracks, the wounds, the behavior, it all pointed to something that shouldn't exist. Around midnight, I heard howling from the direction of Wonder Lake. But mixed in with the wolf calls was something else, sounds that almost sounded like human voices, speaking words I couldn't quite make out. I grabbed my flashlight and stepped onto my porch. The forest was silent except for those distant calls. As I listened, the voices became clearer. They were speaking English. "Mike, Ironcloud," the voice carried across the water. "We know you're there. I don't embarrass easily, but my hands shook as I went back inside and locked the door." The attacks escalated over the next week. 3 more incidents, each more brazen than the last. A hunting party found their truck surrounded by the pack, tires slashed, windows broken, gear scattered. A family camping near Kontishna had their food cache raided, but the creatures had opened canned goods with tools, not claws. I called for backup from headquarters, but the response was bureaucratic nonsense. Unusual predator behavior, they called it. Implement standard wolf management protocols. They had no idea what we were dealing with. Dr. Sarah Mitchell joined me on patrol, bringing her expertise in wolf behavior. What we found defied everything she knew about wildlife. "Look at this," she said, kneeling beside a creek where the pack had been drinking. The mud showed clear handprints alongside wolf tracks. "Opposing thumbs, Mike. Wolves don't have opposing thumbs." We followed the trail to a clearing where we found something that made us both stop in our tracks. The pack had built something. A crude shelter made from branches and animal hides, constructed with intelligence and planning. Inside, we found human belongings, clothing, tools, camping gear, all arranged with care. "They're not just hunting," Sarah whispered. "They're collecting, learning." That evening, we interviewed Maria Santos, a wildlife photographer who'd survived an encounter the previous night. She was calm, professional, and absolutely terrified. "I was in my truck, telephoto lens focused on a moose across the meadow," she said. "Then I noticed movement in my peripheral vision. 7 of them, moving through the trees in formation, not random, they had specific positions, like soldiers." She showed us her photographs. The images were crystal clear. Massive wolves walking upright, using their front limbs like arms, carrying what looked like primitive spears. "The leader came right up to my truck," Maria continued, "stood on its hind legs and looked through the windshield. Then it did something impossible. It traced letters in the dust on my hood. It wrote 'Go away' in perfect English." Sarah and I exchanged looks. "You're sure about that?" I asked. "I have pictures of the writing. But Mike, that's not the worst part. When it wrote those words, it looked right at me and spoke. It said my name." The next day brought our first fatality directly witnessed by survivors. A research team from the university had been taking soil samples near the Teklanika River when the pack attacked in broad daylight. Dr. Rebecca Foster called me on her satellite phone, sobbing and barely coherent. "They took Dr. Hansen," she cried, "right in front of us. But Mike, they didn't just attack him, they spoke to him first. In English, they knew his name, knew he was the team leader. We found Dr. Hansen 3 hours later, or what remained of him. Like David Chen, his body had been arranged carefully, almost ceremonially. But this time, the pack had left a message carved into a nearby tree trunk. Last warning. That night, I made a decision that probably saved my life. Instead of staying at the ranger station, I drove to a ridge overlooking Wonder Lake and set up a observation post with night vision equipment. What I saw through those scopes changed everything I thought I knew about the natural world. The pack emerged from the forest around midnight, 8 massive shapes moving with purpose toward the research station. In the green glow of night vision, I could see them clearly. They walked upright most of the time, occasionally dropping to 4 legs when terrain demanded it. The largest one, obviously the leader, was carrying what looked like a makeshift spear. They surrounded the research station and began making sounds, not howls, but calls that sounded increasingly like human speech. I could make out words, "Come out, we want to talk." Then the leader did something that made me nearly drop the scope. It stood directly in front of the main building and spoke in clear, loud English. "Dr. Mitchell, we know you're inside. We've been watching you study us. It's time we studied you." Through the station windows, I could see lights flickering as the researchers moved around inside. The pack waited patiently, like they had all the time in the world. After an hour, they melted back into the forest as silently as they'd come. But they'd made their point. This wasn't random predation anymore. This was intelligent, organized, and personal. The confrontation came 3 days later. I was checking trail cameras near Wonder Lake when I heard my name called from the forest. Not shouted, spoken calmly, like someone calling me for dinner. "Mike, Ironcloud. We want to meet." I drew my rifle and turned toward the voice. He stepped out of the tree line about 30 yards away, and I finally got my first clear look at what we'd been tracking. He stood 7 feet tall on his hind legs, covered in thick gray fur that lightened to silver around his face. His head was lupine but larger, with a more prominent forehead and eyes that held unmistakable intelligence. When he spoke, his muzzle moved to form words with remarkable clarity. "Don't be afraid," he said. "I want to talk. My name is Robert Chen." The name hit me like a physical blow. Robert Chen had been a researcher at the university 3 years ago. He'd disappeared during a solo expedition to study traditional hunting grounds used by Alaska Native peoples. "You're supposed to be dead," I said, keeping my rifle trained on him. He laughed, and the sound was both human and wolf. "I was, in a way. The man you knew as Robert Chen died in these mountains. I became something better." "What are you?" "We call ourselves Adlet," he said. "It's an old Inupiaq word. It means those who are both. We are what humans become when they embrace their true nature." 2 more pack members emerged from the trees, flanking me but not approaching. Like Robert, they walked upright and showed clear intelligence in their movements. "The others in your pack," I said. "They're transformed humans too?" "My research team," Robert confirmed. "We found something in the mountains, Mike, an ancient place where the barriers between worlds are thin. We were studying traditional hunting practices when we discovered we could become the ultimate hunters ourselves." "By turning into monsters?" His eyes flashed with anger. "Monsters? We're apex predators with human intelligence. We can survive anything this wilderness throws at us. We're faster, stronger, and smarter than either species alone. You're killing innocent people." "We're protecting our territory," he corrected. "Every predator species does that. But we're not mindless killers. We've been trying to communicate, to establish boundaries. Humans just don't listen." Behind him, the forest filled with movement as the rest of the pack revealed themselves. 8 creatures in total, all standing upright, all watching me with intelligent eyes. "Join us, Mike," Robert said. "You understand this land better than most. You'd make an excellent addition to our pack. And if I refuse, then you're a territorial threat, and we eliminate territorial threats." The pack began to circle me slowly. I realized my rifle might take down 1 or 2, but not all 8. But I also realized something else. They were trying to avoid killing me, if possible. This wasn't just a Duth hunting pack anymore. It was a community, trying to grow. "How?" I asked. "How does the transformation work?" Robert smiled, showing fangs that gleamed in the afternoon sun. "Come with us. Let us show you the place where we were reborn. The choice to change has to be willing. Forced transformation never takes properly." I thought about Sarah and the other researchers, about the families camping in the park, about my responsibility as a ranger. But I also thought about what Robert was offering: power, community, freedom from human limitations. "I need time to think," I said. 24 hours, Robert agreed. Meet us at the old mining claim near Igloo Creek tomorrow at sunset. Come alone, and come with your decision." The pack melted back into the forest as silently as they'd appeared, leaving me alone with the weight of an impossible choice. I didn't meet them at Igloo Creek. Instead, I spent that night driving to the village of Minchamina, where I found an elder named Thomas Keelig, who knew the old stories. He listened to everything I told him, nodding like he'd been expecting this news for years. "Adlet come when the barriers are weak," he said. "Every few generations, the old places wake up. Your park sits on sacred ground, places where transformation was once used to create the ultimate hunters during times of great hunger." He gave me items from his grandfather's medicine bundle, sage, carved bone, and a small pouch of earth from what he called the first hunting ground. "These won't kill them," Thomas warned, "but they'll help you close the door they opened. The choice to change must be willing. That's their strength and their weakness." I drove back to Wonder Lake as the sun set behind the mountains. The pack was waiting for me at the ranger station, all 8 of them standing in a line like a formal reception committee. "Have you decided?" Robert asked. "I have." I pulled out the sage and lit it with my lighter. The smoke made several pack members step back. "I'm closing your door." Robert's eyes narrowed. "You don't understand what you're refusing. We could rule these mountains together." "That's exactly what I understand," I said, "and exactly what I'm refusing." The ritual Thomas had taught me was simple but exhausting. I walked the perimeter of the ancient site that Robert's team had found, burning sage and speaking words in Inupiaq that Thomas had made me memorize. The pack followed at a distance, growing more agitated with each step. As I completed the circle and poured the earth from Thomas's pouch onto the central stone formation, something changed in the air. The weight of supernatural presence lifted, like a storm cloud passing. Robert let out a howl that sounded more human than wolf, a cry of loss and rage. When it ended, he looked at me with eyes that seemed clearer, more confused. "Mike," he said, his voice different. "What happened to us? The transformation wasn't reversed. Couldn't be reversed, after so long. But the supernatural compulsion that had driven them to hunt and recruit was broken. For the first time in months, they were thinking clearly about what they'd become and what they'd done. We worked out an agreement. The pack would relocate to the most remote regions of the park, away from all human activity. They would hunt only wild animals and avoid any contact with people. In exchange, I would file reports describing their attacks as unusual predator behavior and restrict access to their territory. Robert shook my hand before they left, his transformed fingers careful not to scratch my skin. "Thank you," he said, "for giving us back our choice." I never saw them again, but sometimes on quiet nights at Wonder Lake, I hear their calls echoing across the mountains. Still wolves, still human, but no longer driven by supernatural hunger. The official reports list 7 incidents of unusual pack behavior, resolved through standard predator management relocation protocols. 3 researchers requested transfers to other projects. The restricted zones around the ancient sites remain in place, marked as sensitive wildlife habitat. I kept my job, kept my secret, and learned to sleep with one eye open. Because Thomas Keelig was right, the barriers weaken every few generations, and there are more sacred sites scattered throughout Alaska's wilderness than anyone wants to admit. Sometimes I wonder if I made the right choice that day. The pack offered power, community, freedom from human limitations. But every morning when I wake up in my cabin beside Wonder Lake, I'm reminded why I chose to remain merely human. Out here in the wilderness, being human is hard enough without adding fangs to the equation. My name is Patricia Stormwater, but everyone calls me Pat. I've been a park ranger at Lake Clark for 14 years now, and in all that time, I thought I'd seen everything these Alaskan waters could throw at me. I was wrong. It was August 1987, and something was off about Tahlequah Lake. I could feel it in my bones the moment I stepped off my float plane onto the dock at Morrison's fishing lodge. The water looked different, somehow darker, even though the sun was shining bright, and it was warm, way too warm for a glacial lake. "Pat," Jake Morrison called out from the lodge porch. He owned the place, ran fishing trips for tourists who wanted to catch lake trout in one of Alaska's most remote spots. "Thank God you're here. We got problems." I tied down my plane and walked up the wooden dock. The boards felt slippery under my boots, covered in some kind of algae I'd never seen before. Green and thick, like soup. "What kind of problems, Jake?" I asked, pulling my ranger cap down against the sun. Jake was a big man, used to handling whatever the wilderness threw at him. But today his hands were shaking as he lit a cigarette. "My guests are seeing things in the water. Big things. And the fish." He shook his head. "They're acting crazy, Pat. Swimming in circles, jumping out of the water like something's chasing them." I looked out at the lake. Tahlequah stretched 26 miles long, surrounded by mountains that touched the clouds. On a normal day, it was the most beautiful place on earth. Today, it felt like the water was watching me. "What kind of things are your guests seeing?" "They say it's huge, moving under the water. One couple swears they saw a head the size of a truck come up near the far shore." Jake took a long drag of his cigarette. "I know how that sounds. But Pat, I've lived here for 15 years. I know every log, every rock, every shadow on this lake. This is something different." I'd heard stories like this before. City, folks came to Alaska and saw bears in every shadow, monsters in every wave. But Jake wasn't some tourist. He knew these waters better than anyone except maybe the local Dena'ina people. "Show me where they saw it," I said. We took his boat out toward the center of the lake. The water was so clear you could usually see 30 feet down, but today it looked muddy. And warm. I dipped my hand over the side and pulled it back quick. It felt like bath water. "Lake's 20 degrees warmer than normal," Jake said, reading my mind. "Started 3 days ago, same time the fish went crazy. That's when I saw them. Lake trout, hundreds of them, swimming in tight circles near the surface. Their fins were out of the water, and they were making noise, little clicking sounds I'd never heard fish make before." "They're scared," I said, more to myself than to Jake. "Scared of what?" I was about to answer when something hit the bottom of the boat. Hard, the whole 15-foot aluminum boat lifted out of the water for a second, then crashed back down. Jake and I grabbed the sides to keep from falling overboard. "What the hell was that?" Jake's face had gone white. I leaned over the side to look, but the water was too murky to see anything. Then I noticed something else that made my stomach drop. The water around the boat was moving in a perfect circle, like something huge was swimming around us just below the surface. "Jake," I said quietly, "start the engine, now." He yanked the cord 3 times before the motor caught. We headed back to shore fast, but I kept looking over my shoulder. The circular pattern in the water followed us halfway to the dock, then disappeared. That night, I radioed my supervisor in Anchorage. "We might have a situation at Tahlequah," I told him. "Something spooked the fish, and the water temperature's all wrong." "Probably just a warm spell," he said through the static. "You know how tourists get. They see a floating log and think it's a sea monster." But I couldn't shake the feeling that this was bigger than tourists and floating logs. I'd grown up fishing with my grandfather on lakes all over Alaska. Fish don't swim in circles unless something's hunting them. And they don't make clicking sounds unless they're trying to warn each other about danger. I spent the night in my tent by the shore, listening to the water lap against the rocks. Usually, lake sounds put me right to sleep. Tonight, every splash made me sit up and reach for my flashlight. Because under the normal lake sounds, I could hear something else. Something like singing, low and deep, coming from somewhere far below the surface. When morning came, I was tired but ready to figure out what was going on. I had my diving gear, my underwater camera, and a thermos full of coffee. I figured I'd take a look under the water and solve this mystery once and for all. I should have listened to the fish. The morning, Jake Morrison didn't come back from his fishing trip. I knew we weren't dealing with tourist imagination anymore. I was eating breakfast when Sarah, Jake's wife, came running down to the dock. Her face was streaked with tears, and she was still wearing her pajamas under a rain jacket. "Pat, Jake left at 5 this morning with the Henderson family. They were supposed to be back by 9 for lunch." She looked out at the lake, shading her eyes against the sun. "It's almost noon." I grabbed my binoculars and scanned the water. Nothing. Just that weird algae bloom and the fish still swimming their crazy circles. "Did you try the radio?" No answer. I've been calling every 15 minutes. That's when we saw it. A white speck way out on the lake, drifting near the far shore. Through the binoculars, I could make out the shape of Jake's boat, but it was upside down. "Stay here," I told Sarah, already running toward my float plane. "Call the state troopers. Tell them we need a search and rescue team." It took me 10 minutes to get my plane started and another 5 to fly to where the boat was floating. As I circled overhead, my mouth went dry. The aluminum hull was crushed in from underneath, like something had grabbed it and squeezed. There were gouges in the metal, long, parallel scratches that looked like claw marks. But claws from what? The biggest thing in these lakes were pike, maybe 4 feet long. These marks looked like they came from something the size of a grizzly bear. I landed my plane nearby and tied it to the overturned boat. The water around the wreck was deeper than I'd thought, at least 100 feet. Perfect darkness below. I put on my diving gear and slipped into the water. It was warm, like swimming in a heated pool. The weird algae stuck to my mask, and I had to keep wiping it clean. I dove down toward the boat, looking for bodies. But 20 feet under, I saw something that made me forget all about search and rescue. There were marks on the lake bottom. Drag marks, like something huge had pulled itself across the mud, and they led away from the boat toward the deep part of the lake. I followed the trail until my depth gauge read 60 feet. That's when I saw the first bone. It was white and clean, picked spotless, too big to be from a fish. As I got closer, I realized it was a human femur. Then I saw another bone, and another. They were arranged in a neat pile, like someone had stacked them there on purpose. My heart was pounding so hard I could hear it echo in my diving helmet. I grabbed one of the smaller bones and kicked hard for the surface. Sarah was waiting on the dock when I got back, along with 2 state troopers who'd flown in from Anchorage. I showed them the bone. It was definitely human, definitely old. Maybe months, maybe years. "We found the boat," I told them, "but there's something down there. Something big enough to flip a 15-foot boat and strong enough to crush aluminum." Trooper Williams, the older of the two, looked at me like I was crazy. "What are you saying, exactly?" I didn't want to say it. It sounded insane even in my own head. But I'd seen the drag marks, the scratches on the boat, the pile of bones. "I'm saying something killed Jake Morrison and his passengers. Something that lives in this lake." The troopers spent the rest of the day diving and searching. They found more bones, all human, all old. But no sign of Jake or the Henderson family. It was like they'd just vanished. That night, Williams pulled me aside. "Pat, I've been doing this job for 20 years. I've seen bear attacks, plane crashes, all kinds of wilderness accidents. But I've never seen anything like those boat marks. What do you think made them?" He was quiet for a long time, staring out at the dark water. "I don't know. And that scares me more than I want to admit." The next morning, we had our answer. Sort of. Mrs. Yamamoto was visiting from Japan, staying at the lodge with her teenage daughter. They were out in a kayak near shore when she started screaming. Sarah and I ran down to the dock and saw her pointing at something in the water. There, big, very big," she kept shouting in broken English. I grabbed my binoculars and looked where she was pointing. At first, I didn't see anything. Then the water bulged upward, like something huge was rising from below. The bulge got bigger and bigger, until I could see it was the back of something covered in dark, mottled scales. It had to be 60 feet long, maybe more. It moved through the water smooth and quiet, like a snake, but thicker than any snake I'd ever imagined. As it swam past the kayak, I caught a glimpse of what might have been a head, flat and wide, with eyes the size of dinner plates. Then it was gone, disappeared back into the depths like it had never been there. Mrs. Yamamoto paddled to shore as fast as she could, babbling in Japanese and English about a dragon in the water. Her daughter was crying. Sarah had gone white as a sheet. I lowered my binoculars with shaking hands. In 14 years as a park ranger, I'd seen bears, wolves, moose, eagles. I'd seen avalanches and forest fires and lightning storms that could split trees in half. But I'd never seen anything like the thing living in Telequana Lake, and now it had tasted human blood. The creature, I started thinking of it as the Tizaruk after remembering the old Denaina stories my grandfather used to tell, didn't wait long for its next victim. Dr. Sandra Chen arrived 3 days later with enough equipment to study a whole ocean. She was a marine biologist from the University of Alaska, brought in to figure out what we were dealing with. Smart woman, but she didn't believe in lake monsters. There's got to be a logical explanation, she told me as we unloaded her sonar equipment. Sturgeon can grow quite large in these northern lakes. Or it could be debris from an old plane crash, moving with the currents. I wanted to believe her. I really did. But I'd seen those eyes. No fish had eyes like that, ancient and intelligent, like they were thinking. We set up her equipment on Jake's dock. The sonar could map the lake bottom and track anything moving in the water. The underwater cameras would let us see what was down there without risking another dive. Lakes deeper than your charts show, Dr. Chen said, studying the sonar readings. I'm getting returns from 200 feet, maybe more. And there are cave systems down there. Big ones. That matched what Albert Kijik had told me. Albert was the oldest Dena'ina elder in the region, and he'd agreed to meet with us after hearing about the attacks. My grandfather's grandfather told stories of the Tizaruk, Albert had said, his weathered hands wrapped around a coffee cup. Big water spirit, older than the mountains, used to protect the lake from bad things. But something made it angry. What kind of something? I'd asked. Albert had looked out at the water with sad eyes. People stopped showing respect, started taking too much, giving nothing back. The Tizaruk remembers when this was all sacred ground. Now, watching Dr. Chen's equipment map the underwater caves, I wondered if Albert was right. Maybe we'd disturbed something that should have been left alone. The first night we had the cameras running, we got footage that made my blood run cold. The underwater lights showed the lake bottom clearly rocky, covered in that strange algae. But at 3 a.m, something moved across the camera's view. It was just a shadow at first, sliding between the rocks like flowing water. Then the camera caught it full on, and I saw what had killed Jake Morrison. The Tizaruk was even bigger than I'd thought. The part we could see in the camera frame had to be 15 feet across, covered in dark scales, that shifted color like oil on water. But it wasn't just the size that scared me, it was the way it moved. Deliberate. Purposeful. Like it knew the camera was there, and wanted us to see it. My God, Dr. Chen whispered, leaning closer to the monitor. What is that? Before I could answer, the creature turned toward the camera. Its head filled the screen flat and wide like a crocodile's, but with forward-facing eyes that gleamed with intelligence. It studied the camera for a long moment, then opened its mouth. The teeth were like railroad spikes. Hundreds of them, in rows that went back into darkness. The creature closed its mouth, gave what looked almost like a nod, then swam away into the depths. We need to call this in, Dr. Chen said. Get the military, the Coast Guard, somebody. But I was thinking about Albert's words. About respect and sacred ground. Let me try something first. The next morning, I took Albert's advice and made an offering to the lake. Just some tobacco and a prayer, the way my grandfather had taught me. I felt stupid doing it, talking to the water like it could hear me. But I was running out of rational options. For a while, it seemed to work. The creature stayed in the deep water, away from shore. The fish stopped their crazy swimming. Even the water temperature started to drop back to normal. Then the Wilson family arrived. They were from California, Dad, Mom, 2 teenage boys. They'd booked the lodge months ago for a wilderness fishing experience. Sarah tried to talk them into postponing, but they'd already paid their deposit. We came here to fish, Mr. Wilson said. We're not going to let some local ghost story ruin our vacation. I should have made them leave, should have used my authority as a park ranger to close the area. But they seemed like good people, and part of me hoped maybe the offering had actually worked. On their second day, the Wilson boys took a small boat out to try their luck. At the drop-off where the lake went from 30 feet to 200. I was watching from the lodge with binoculars when it happened. The water around their boat started to churn. Not like waves or wind, like something huge was circling underneath. The boys must have felt it too, because they started trying to start their engine. That's when the Tizaruk came up. It rose out of the water like a submarine, surfacing, but smooth and alive. Water poured off its scales as more and more of it emerged. 50 feet, 60, 70 feet of serpentine body, thick as a tree trunk, with that terrible crocodile head at the front. The boys were screaming, pulling frantically at the starter cord. The engine coughed but wouldn't catch. The creature looked at them the way a cat looks at mice. Then it opened its mouth and made a sound I'll never forget, low and deep, like a foghorn made of nightmares. The sound rolled across the water and hit the shore like a physical thing. One of the boys fell overboard from the shock of it. His brother dove in after him without thinking. The boat drifted away, empty. I was already running for my float plane when the Tizaruk went under. By the time I got airborne, there was nothing left but ripples on the water. We searched for 3 days. Coast Guard came in with helicopters and divers. We dragged every inch of the lake bottom we could reach. But we never found the Wilson boys. On the 3rd night, Albert Kijik came to see me at the lodge. "The Tizaruk isn't evil," he said quietly, "but it's angry. And scared. Your people keep coming, keep taking. It doesn't understand the difference between respect and invasion." "What does it want?" I asked. Albert looked out at the dark water. "Same thing we all want. To be left alone in the place where it belongs." But I knew it was too late for that. Word was getting out. Soon there would be news crews and monster hunters and government scientists. The Tizaruk would never have peace again. Unless I found a way to make them understand that some places in Alaska aren't meant for humans. Some places belong to older things, deeper things, things that remember when the world was young. The question was, would anyone listen before more people died? The answer came sooner than I'd hoped. And it wasn't what I'd expected. Dr. Chen had been working around the clock, studying the footage and sonar readings. She'd brought in specialist equipment from Anchorage hydrophones that could pick up sounds underwater, cameras that worked in complete darkness, and computer programs that could analyze animal behavior. "Pat, you need to see this." She called me over to her computer setup on the 4th morning after the Wilson boys disappeared. On the screen were wave patterns, the visual representation of sounds the hydrophones had picked up. But these weren't random noise. "The creature is communicating, Dr. Chen said, pointing to repeated patterns in the waves. "These calls have structure, rhythm. They're not just animal sounds, they're language." That hit me like a punch to the stomach. Bad enough that we were dealing with a monster, but an intelligent monster that could think and plan? That changed everything. "There's more," Dr. Chen continued. "I've been analyzing the attacks. They're not random. The creature specifically targets people who venture into certain areas of the lake. It's defending territory." She pulled up a map of the lake on her laptop, with red X's marking where each incident had happened. They formed a rough circle around the deepest part of the lake, where the sonar showed the biggest cave systems. "It's protecting something," I said. "That's what I think too." "But what?" "Albert Kijik could have told us, but he'd left 2 days ago to consult with other elders. Said he needed to remember the old stories properly before he could help us anymore." That afternoon, against my better judgment, Dr. Chen talked me into a dive to investigate the cave systems. We went down in a submersible she'd borrowed from the Coast Guard, a tiny metal sphere with windows and robotic arms for collecting samples. The water was crystal clear once we got below the algae layer. I could see why the Tizaruk had chosen this place. The underwater landscape was beautiful, rocky formations that looked like underwater cathedrals, lit by our spotlights in blues and greens I'd never seen before. We were at 150 feet when we found the entrance to the main cave system. It was huge, big enough to drive a truck through, and it was definitely artificial. The walls were too smooth, too regular to be natural. "Someone carved this," Dr. Chen said, her voice crackling through the radio. "Look at those markings." The cave walls were covered in symbols, spirals, and fish shapes, and something that looked like a giant serpent. They were old, worn smooth by water, but still visible in our lights. "Denaina?" I asked. "Older, I think, much older." We followed the cave deeper into the mountain. Our lights showed side passages branching off in all directions, like an underwater city. And everywhere, more carvings, more symbols. Some looked like stars, others like people dancing. And always, always, the image of the great serpent. That's when we found the chamber. It opened up in front of us, like an underwater cathedral, so big our lights couldn't reach the far walls. And floating in the center, perfectly preserved by the cold water, were dozens of human remains, but not skeletons, mummies. Their skin was dark and leathery, but intact. Their clothes had rotted away, but you could see they'd been wrapped in what looked like ceremonial shrouds. "My God," Doctor," Chen whispered. "Pat, this is a burial ground, an ancient burial ground." And that's when the Tizaruk found us. I saw it first in the lights, a shadow moving along the far wall of the chamber. Then it came closer, and I realized just how big it really was. In the open water, I'd only seen parts of it. Here, in the confined space of the cave, I could see the whole creature. It was over 90 feet long, thick as a subway car, with 4 powerful flippers and that terrible head. Its scales shifted color as it moved black to dark green to deep blue. And its eyes were ancient, older than the mountains, older than the ice. They looked at our little submersible with an intelligence that made me feel like an ant being studied by a professor. "Don't move," I told Dr. Chen. "Don't do anything sudden." The Tizaruk circled us slowly, like a shark sizing up prey. But there was something different about its movements, not aggressive, more like protective. Like it was checking to make sure we weren't going to damage something. Then it did something that changed everything I thought I knew about monsters. It spoke, not in words. The sound came from deep in its chest, a low harmonic that vibrated through the water and into our submarine. But somehow, I understood. Images flashed in my mind, not my thoughts, its thoughts. I saw the lake as it had been hundreds of years ago. I saw the Denaina people coming to this sacred place to bury their dead, to speak with the spirits of the water. I saw the Tizaruk not as a monster, but as a guardian, protecting the burial ground from grave robbers and desecrators. I saw what had made it angry: modern boats dumping oil and garbage, tourists taking souvenirs from sacred sites, developers wanting to build resorts on burial grounds. The creature wasn't a monster, it was trying to protect its people's resting place, the only way it knew how. "It's not evil," I said to Dr. Chen. It's just trying to do its job." The Tizaruk seemed to sense that I understood. It moved closer to our submarine and touched the glass with one massive flipper. Gently, almost sadly, then it sang. The sound filled the water around us, a song of loneliness and duty and ages of watching over the dead. I felt tears running down my face inside my diving mask. This creature had been alone for so long, protecting a secret that no one remembered, fighting a war that no one understood. "We have to help it," I said. "How, Dr. Chen asked. "How do you help something like that?" But I was already thinking. Albert had said the creature wanted respect, recognition. Maybe there was a way to give it what it needed without anyone else getting hurt. The Tizaruk released our submarine and swam back into the shadows of the chamber. But before it disappeared completely, it turned and looked at me one more time. And in that look, I saw hope. Now I just had to figure out how to explain all this to the outside world before they sent in the military to kill the last guardian of an ancient sacred place. The clock was ticking, and I was running out of time. Albert Kijik returned the next morning with 3 other elders and a plan I never could have imagined. "The old agreements are still binding," he told me as we gathered around the map table in the lodge. "My ancestors made a treaty with the Tizaruk centuries ago. The creature protects the burial grounds, and our people protect the creature. But everyone forgot the old ways." "What kind of treaty?" I asked. Elder Mary Wassily, Albert's cousin, spread out a piece of deerskin covered in symbols similar to what we'd seen in the underwater caves. Recognition ceremony, offering ceremony. Boundaries marked and respected by both sides. "Will it work?" Dr. Chen asked. "After all this time?" Albert looked out at the lake, where the morning sun made the water shine like gold. "The Tizaruk remembers. It's been waiting for someone to remember too." The ceremony took place at sunset, when the water was calm and the mountains reflected purple in the Pervision Lake. All the elders were there, along with me and Dr. Chen and Sarah Morrison. We'd sent word to Anchorage to delay any military action for 48 hours. I'd convinced them we had a breakthrough in negotiations with local environmental groups. Albert waded into the water up to his waist and began to sing in the old language. The song was deep and rhythmic, almost like the sounds the Tizaruk had made. The other elders joined in, their voices carrying across the water. At first, nothing happened. Then I saw ripples in the center of the lake, moving against the wind. The ripples got bigger, and the water began to bulge upward. The Tizaruk surfaced slowly this time, with dignity instead of threat. Its great head broke the surface 50 feet from shore, water streaming from its scales. But its eyes were calm now, watching Albert with what looked like relief. Albert spoke to the creature in Dena'ina, then in English, for the rest of us. We remember the old covenant. We ask forgiveness for the disrespect shown to the sacred places. We offer protection for the guardian in exchange for protection of our people. The Tizruk listened, its ancient eyes moving from face to face. Then it responded not with the terrible foghorn sound I'd heard before, but with something like singing, sad and beautiful and older than any human memory. It accepts, Albert translated. But there must be boundaries. No boats in the deep water where the burial grounds are. No diving without permission. No taking from the sacred places. I stepped forward. As a representative of the National Park Service, I agree to these terms. The burial grounds will be protected under federal law. The deep water will be designated as a cultural preservation zone. The ceremony continued until full darkness fell. We made offerings of tobacco and food to the lake. The elders sang the old songs, and the Tizruk listened to every word, sometimes responding with its own harmonies, that made the water itself seem to sing. When it was over, the creature approached the shore one last time. It looked directly at me and made a sound that was almost like a purr. Then it sank back into the depths and was gone. But not really gone. I knew it was still down there, still watching, still protecting the ancient burial ground from those who would disturb the dead. The official report listed the incidents at Telequana Lake as equipment failures and weather-related accidents. The deep water areas were quietly designated as archaeological preservation zones, off-limits to boats and divers without special permits that were never issued. A small visitor center was built near the lodge, staffed by Dena'ina cultural guides who told tourists about the lake's spiritual significance and the importance of respecting sacred places. Most visitors listened. Those who didn't? Well, they usually changed their minds after their first glimpse of something large moving beneath the surface. Dr. Chen went back to the university with footage and data that would keep her busy for years. She published papers about unknown aquatic species and the importance of protecting isolated ecosystems. She never mentioned that the species was intelligent, or that it could communicate, or that it was older than recorded history. Some secrets are too dangerous for the outside world to know. I stayed on at Lake Clark, of course. The Tizruk and I had an understanding now. Sometimes, on calm evenings, I would see it surface far from shore and know it was checking on things, making sure the boundaries were being respected, making sure the dead could rest in peace. Albert visits every few months to renew the ceremonies and teach the younger generation about the old agreements. The lake has been quiet since that night. No more disappearances, no more strange incidents, just the normal rhythms of wilderness life. But I've never forgotten what I learned in that underwater burial chamber. Alaska is full of places where the old world touches the new, where ancient spirits still walk among the trees and swim in the deepest lakes. Most of the time, they want nothing more than to be left alone. The problem comes when we forget that some places don't belong to us. Some places belong to older things, deeper things, things that remember when the world was young and wild and full of magic. The Tizruk taught me that. And now, whenever I fly over remote lakes in the Alaska wilderness, I wonder what else might be down there, waiting in the dark water, protecting secrets we've forgotten how to respect. Sometimes, late at night when the lake is perfectly still, I can hear singing drifting up from the depths. Old songs in an older language, sung by a voice that has been keeping watch for centuries. And I sleep better knowing that some guardians never abandon their posts, no matter how long they have to wait for the rest of us to remember our promises. The Tizruk is still down there, still watching, still protecting the sacred places where the dead rest in peace. And that's exactly how it should be. My name is David Ravenfeather, but everyone calls me Dave. I've been a park ranger for 20 years now, working the most remote corners of Alaska's wilderness. Before that, I spent 8 years as an Army Ranger, so I know a thing or two about surviving in places where most people would die in a day. The Yukon Flats National Wildlife Refuge is my home. It's a place where you can walk for 300 miles and never see another human being. Just endless forests, swamps, and lakes stretching to the horizon. In June, the sun never sets. It just circles around the sky like a lazy vulture, making everything feel strange and dreamlike. I thought I'd seen everything the wilderness could throw at me. Bears, wolves, blizzards that could freeze your blood solid. I'd pulled lost hikers out of places that weren't even on the maps. I was the guy they called when someone went missing in the deep country, because if anyone could find them, it was me. That all changed in June of 1991. It started with Emma Thompson. She was a wilderness guide from Fairbanks, tough as nails and smart as a whip. Emma knew the backcountry better than most rangers. She'd been leading groups through Alaska's wild places for 15 years, without so much as a sprained ankle. So when the call came in that Emma had been found wandering around 50 miles from where she was supposed to be, confused and talking about little people leading her through the forest, I knew something was seriously wrong. I found Emma at the ranger station in Fort Yukon, wrapped in a blanket and staring at nothing. Her eyes had that 1,000-yard stare I'd seen in combat veterans. Her hands shook when she tried to drink coffee. "Dave," she said when she saw me, "thank God you're here. They're real. The little people the Gwich'in elders talk about. They're real, and they've been playing games with me for 3 days." I sat down across from her. Emma wasn't the type to make up stories or crack under pressure. If she said something happened, it happened. "Tell me everything," I said. Emma's story didn't make sense. She'd entered the wilderness on a solo camping trip, following a route she'd taken dozens of times before. On the second day, she heard children laughing in the forest. She followed the sound, thinking maybe a family was camping nearby. But there was nobody there, she said. Just trees and moss. Then I heard the voices again, calling to me in Gwich'in. "Come this way," they said. "We'll show you something beautiful." For 3 days, Emma followed the voices. They led her through parts of the forest she'd never seen before, even though she was supposedly in familiar territory. The voices would guide her to water when she was thirsty, to shelter when it rained. They kept her safe, but they also kept her lost. When the search plane finally spotted her, Emma was 80 miles from her planned route. She had no memory of how she'd gotten there. "Dave, I know how this sounds," she said, grabbing my arm. "But they were taking care of me. The whole time I was lost, I never felt scared. It was like being guided by invisible children who wanted to play." I looked at Emma's GPS unit. The tracking data showed her route as a crazy zigzag pattern, circling back on itself, making loops that defied logic. No lost person walks in perfect circles unless something is very wrong with their head. Emma's head was fine. That night, I studied the maps of the area where Emma had been found. The Chandalar River Valley was a maze of wetlands and thick forest. It was also the heart of Gwich'in territory, where the old stories lived. My grandmother had been Gwich'in. She'd told me stories about the Irsnarat when I was little, tiny people who lived underground and sometimes helped lost travelers. Sometimes they played tricks on them, too. I'd always figured they were just stories to keep kids from wandering off alone. Now, I wasn't so sure. The next morning, I packed my gear for a solo trip into the Chandalar Valley. I had to see for myself what had happened to Emma. As I loaded my truck, I felt eyes watching me from the forest. When I turned to look, there was nothing there but shadows and trees. The feeling followed me all the way to the trailhead. I started where Emma's GPS track began to get weird, about 15 miles into the wilderness. The trail was clear enough, a game path that wound between spruce trees and around boggy patches. Emma had marked some of these spots with bright orange flagging tape on her way in, except the tape wasn't where her GPS said it should be. I found the first piece of flagging about a quarter-mile off the recorded route, tied to a tree that Emma's GPS claimed she'd never been near. I checked my own GPS 3 times. The readings were solid. Emma's track showed her going straight, but her tape showed her turning left. I followed the flagging tape instead of the GPS track. Within an hour, I found something that made my skin crawl. Footprints. But not Emma's. These were tiny, maybe 6 inches long and half as wide. They looked human, with 5 toes and a heel, but they belonged to something the size of a small child. The prints were everywhere, dozens of them, circling the tree where Emma had tied her tape. I took pictures and measurements. The prints were fresh, maybe a day old. They were also impossible. There were no kids within 100 miles of this place. I followed the tiny tracks. They led deeper into the forest, weaving between trees in a pattern that hurt my head to follow. Every few hundred yards, I'd find more of Emma's flagging tape, always in the wrong place according to my GPS. Around midday, I heard the voices. Children's laughter, echoing through the trees like wind chimes in a breeze. I stopped walking and listened. The sound came from ahead of me, then to my left, then behind me. It seemed to move through the forest, faster than anything human could run. "Hello?" I called out. The laughter stopped. For a moment, the forest was completely silent. No birds, no insects, no wind. Even my heartbeat seemed too loud. Then a small voice spoke, very close to my ear. "Ranger Dave wants to play too?" I spun around. Nothing. Just trees and shadows and the smell of moss and pine needles. My radio crackled. "Dave, this is Base. Do you copy?" I grabbed the radio. "Base, this is Dave. I copy. We've got another one, Dave. Dr. Mark Peters, archaeologist from the university, found him this morning, about 80 miles northeast of your position. Same condition as Emma Thompson. My blood went cold. Same how, confused, disoriented, talking about invisible guides. His GPS track is all screwed up too. Looks like he walked in circles for 4 days. I looked around at the tiny footprints scattered everywhere. I'll be there in 6 hours. Negative, Dave. Peters is asking for you. Specifically. Says the little people told him you'd understand." The radio went dead. I tried to raise base again, but got nothing but static. When I checked my GPS, it showed me standing in the middle of a lake that was clearly a quarter-mile away. Something small and unseen giggled in the bushes nearby. I packed up fast and started hiking toward the coordinates Base had given me for Dr. Peters. But after an hour of walking, I realized I was going in circles. Every tree started looking the same. Every hill looked familiar. My compass pointed north, but north kept changing direction. The sun hung in the sky like a broken clock, giving me no sense of time or direction. This was the heart of summer in Alaska, when day and night blended together into an endless twilight that could drive a person crazy if they weren't careful. I stopped and sat down on a fallen log. This was exactly what had happened to Emma. Something was playing with my navigation, leading me around like a dog on a leash. "Okay," I said out loud. "I know you're there. What do you want?" A tiny voice answered from right behind my head. "We want to show you the lost man. He's scared and calling for Ranger Dave." I didn't turn around. Something told me I wouldn't see anything, even if I did. "Where is he?" "Follow the singing trees." I listened. At first I heard nothing. Then, very faintly, I caught the sound of wind through pine needles. But it wasn't random. It had a rhythm, almost like a melody. The sound seemed to come from my left. I followed the singing trees for 2 hours. The melody stayed just ahead of me, leading me through parts of the forest I'd never seen before. My GPS showed me walking through solid rock, then underwater, then off the edge of the map entirely. Finally, I found Dr. Peters. He was sitting by a small fire, staring at the flames with the same empty look Emma had worn. He was a small man, maybe 50 years old, with graying hair and thick glasses. His clothes were dirty but not torn. He didn't look like he'd been struggling to survive. "Dr. Peters?" I called out. He looked up at me and smiled. "Ranger Dave, they said you'd come. They said you'd understand about the little people." I sat down beside his fire. "Tell me what happened." Peter's story was almost identical to Emma's. He'd come to the area to study old Gwich'in burial sites. On his second day, he'd heard voices calling to him. Children's voices, speaking in a language he didn't recognize but somehow understood. They'd led him through the forest for 4 days. They'd shown him fresh water, safe places to sleep, berries to eat. They'd kept him warm when it rained and cool when the sun was too bright. "But they never let me go where I wanted to go," Peters said. "Every time I tried to head back to my car, the voices would start up again. 'This way is better,' they'd say. 'Come see the pretty lake.' And I'd follow them, even though I knew I shouldn't." I looked around Peter's campsite. It was too perfect. The fire was exactly the right size, built with stones arranged in a circle that looked ancient. Fresh water bubbled up from a spring that wasn't on any map. The ground had been cleared of rocks and roots, making a perfect sleeping spot. "Did you see them?" I asked. Peter shook his head. "Just glimpses. Little shapes moving in my peripheral vision. Sometimes I'd see tiny footprints in the mud, but when I bent down to look closer, they'd be gone. As we talked, I became aware of movement in the forest around us. Nothing I could see directly, but shadows that shifted when they shouldn't, branches that swayed without wind. We were being watched by things that didn't want to be seen. When I tried to lead Peters out of the forest, we got lost immediately. My compass spun like a pinwheel. My GPS showed us walking in a straight line that somehow brought us back to the same campsite 3 times. The voices started up again as the sun began to set, though in June in Alaska, that just meant the light got a little softer. "Ranger Dave," whispered a small voice from the darkness. "We need to talk." I told Dr. Peters to stay by the fire and walked toward the voice. 20 feet into the forest, I found a circle of tiny stones arranged around a miniature fire pit. The stones were smooth and white, polished like river rocks. In the center was a fire no bigger than a candle flame, but it gave off enough light to see by. "Sit," said the voice. It came from everywhere and nowhere at once. I sat down beside the tiny fire. "What are you?" "We are the ones who came before," the voice replied. "We are the guardians of the old places. Your people call us Ersenrat." The fire flickered, and in the flames, I saw shapes. Tiny human figures, maybe 2 feet tall, with dark skin and traditional native clothing. They moved through the flames like dancers, their faces serious, but not unfriendly. "Why are you confusing people? Emma and Dr. Peters could have died out here." A different voice answered, younger sounding. "We keep them safe. We feed them, give them water, shelter them from storms, but we cannot let them go where they want to go." "Why not?" The first voice spoke again. "Because they would disturb the sacred places, the burial grounds of our people, the sites where young ones go to seek visions, places that must not be touched by digging tools and cameras." I thought about Dr. Peters' research. He'd come here to study archaeological sites, probably including old burial grounds. Emma's route would have taken her through several areas that I knew were important to the Gwich'in people. "So you get them lost instead?" "We guide them around the sacred places. We show them the beauty of the forest that is safe to see. When they are ready to leave, we help them find their way to where searchers will find them." It made sense, in a weird way. Both Emma and Dr. Peters had been found in good condition, well-fed and hydrated. They'd both described feeling cared for, even while being confused about their location. But there was something else. The voices sounded strained, almost tired. "How many people have you been dealing with lately?" I asked. The young voice answered, "Too many. Every summer, more and more come. They bring loud machines and digging tools. They camp in the sacred places and leave trash in the old burial grounds. We cannot keep up with all of them." "What happens when you can't keep up?" Silence for a long moment. Then the first voice, very quietly, "Sometimes we have to be more direct." The fire went out, plunging me into darkness. I heard movement all around me, the sound of tiny feet running through the underbrush, whispered conversations in a language I didn't understand, the rustle of small bodies moving through the trees. When I got back to Peter's campsite, he was gone. His fire was still burning, his pack was still there, along with all his gear. But Peters himself had vanished without a trace. I called his name until my throat was raw. I searched with my flashlight until the batteries died. Finally, exhausted, I sat down by his fire to wait for dawn. That's when I heard him screaming. The sound came from underground. Peter's voice, muffled and distant, crying out from somewhere beneath my feet. I pressed my ear to the forest floor and could hear him clearly. He was maybe 10 feet down, calling for help. I started digging with my hands, then with Peter's camping shovel. The ground was soft muskeg, easy to move, but every shovelful I removed seemed to fill itself back in. After an hour of digging, I'd made no progress at all. The voices spoke from the darkness around me. "Stop digging, Ranger Dave. Let him go. He hasn't done anything wrong. He has a metal detector," said the young voice. "He plans to find and remove sacred objects from burial sites. We cannot allow this." I stopped digging. Peter's screaming had stopped too. The forest was quiet except for the sound of my own breathing. "Is he alive?" "He is safe in the deep places. We do not harm unless we must." but he cannot leave until he promises to respect the sacred sites. I sat back on my heels. What if he won't promise? No answer. Over the next 3 hours, I tried everything I could think of. I dug in a dozen different spots, following the sound of Peter's voice. But the ground seemed to have a mind of its own, filling in behind me no matter how fast I worked. I tried reasoning with the voices, promising that I'd make sure Peters understood about the sacred sites. I tried threatening them, warning that more searchers would come if Peters disappeared. Nothing worked. As the sky began to lighten, though in the midnight sun it had never really gotten dark, I heard new sounds in the forest. Heavy footsteps. Human. Voices calling out. The crackle of radio communications. The search team had arrived. I packed Peter's gear quickly and hiked toward the sounds. I found 6 rangers and a helicopter pilot setting up a base camp about a mile away. They'd been looking for both Peters and me since my radio had gone dead the day before. "Dave," called out Jim Kowalski, the lead ranger. "Thank God. Where's Peters?" I told them about finding Peters at his campsite, then losing him again. I didn't mention the voices or the underground screaming. Not yet. The search went on for 12 hours. We combed every inch of forest for 3 miles in every direction. We found nothing. It was like Peters had simply vanished into thin air. That night, as we sat around our campfire planning the next day's search, I heard the voices again. They were arguing among themselves in rapid Gwich'in, too fast for me to follow. But I caught a few words. Too many. Dangerous. Must stop them. Jim was studying a map when his GPS unit suddenly went haywire. The screen showed our location, jumping around randomly. First we were in Canada, then in the middle of the Bering Sea, then on the moon. "Equipment malfunction," Jim muttered, turning off the GPS. But I knew better. The Ursenrat were getting more active, more aggressive. They were starting to affect the whole search team, not just individual hikers. That's when I realized we weren't just dealing with confused tourists anymore. We were in the middle of a war between ancient guardians and modern intruders, and people were going to die if I didn't figure out how to stop it. Around midnight, one of the younger rangers, Kelly Martinez, went to check the perimeter of our camp. She was 23 years old, fresh out of ranger training, eager to prove herself. She never came back. We found her tracks leading away from camp in a perfectly straight line. They went about 50 yards, then just stopped. Not like she'd turned around or been picked up. The footprints literally ended in the middle of a clear patch of ground. Kelly's radio was on the ground where her tracks stopped. When we tried to call her, we could hear her voice coming from underground, just like Peter's. But this time, she was screaming in terror. I couldn't let this continue. 2 people were trapped underground by things that claimed to be protecting sacred sites, and a young ranger was scared out of her mind somewhere beneath our feet. I told Jim to take the rest of the team and hike out to the helicopter. "This isn't a normal search and rescue," I said. "There's something else going on here, something I need to handle alone." Jim started to argue, but another ranger's GPS unit began sparking and smoking. Then our satellite phone went dead. The forest around us filled with the sound of children giggling. "Get out," I told them, "now, before you all end up underground too." After they left, I sat alone by the dying campfire and waited. I didn't have to wait long. The tiny fire pit appeared again, this time right next to my feet. The miniature flames danced up, and the voices spoke. "Ranger Dave understands now," said the first voice. "Your people bring tools to disturb the sleeping ancestors. We cannot allow this." "But you're hurting innocent people," I said. "Kelly Martinez is just a kid doing her job. Dr. Peters is a scientist. They're not trying to hurt anyone." "Intent does not matter," said a new voice, older and colder than the others. "The sacred places must be protected. If your people will not respect them, then your people must be stopped." The flames flickered higher, and I saw more shapes dancing in the fire. Dozens of tiny figures, maybe hundreds. They filled the flames like an army of 2-foot-tall warriors, their faces painted for battle. "How long have you been down there?" I asked. "Since the ice came and went," said the old voice. "Since the first people walked these lands. We have always been the guardians. And now you're at war with us. Your people made it war when they decided the sacred places were more important for their science than for the spirits of the dead." I thought about my grandmother's stories. The Ursenrat had always been tricksters, leading people astray when they went where they shouldn't go. But they'd also been helpers, guiding lost travelers to safety. Something had changed. The balance had shifted. What if we could work together? I asked. What if I could make sure people respected the sacred sites? The old voice laughed, a sound like wind through dry leaves. One ranger cannot control all the people who come. Every year there are more. Every year they bring bigger machines, dig deeper holes. Then show me the sacred places. Let me map them officially. Get them protected by law. Your laws mean nothing to people who hunt for gold and ancient artifacts. They come in, secret, at night, with metal detectors and shovels. The fire began to grow, spreading beyond the tiny stone circle. The flames climbed higher, and the shapes within them became clearer. I could see individual faces now, ancient, wise, and very angry. Let my people go, I said. Peters, Kelly, Emma, if you still have her. They'll leave and never come back. I promise. We do not have the woman, Emma, said the young voice. She was released when she promised to tell no one of our sacred places. But you do have the others. They are safe in the deep places. They will remain safe as long as they do not try to disturb the sacred sites. You can't keep them forever. We can keep them as long as necessary. I stood up, anger flaring in my chest. That's kidnapping. That's wrong, no matter what you're trying to protect. The fire exploded outward, surrounding me with flames that didn't burn. Tiny figures stepped out of the fire and became solid, real, standing around me in a circle. They were exactly as my grandmother had described, small people, maybe 2 feet tall, with weathered brown skin and traditional Gwich'in clothing. Their faces were serious, their eyes ancient, but they weren't quite human. Their proportions were wrong, their movements too quick and fluid. And when they spoke, their voices seemed to come from the earth itself. You will come with us, said the old one, who wore a headdress made of tiny feathers and bones. You will see the sacred places. You will understand why they must be protected. Before I could object, the ground beneath my feet gave way. I fell through earth that felt like water, tumbling down through darkness that smelled of roots and ancient things. I landed in a vast underground chamber lit by phosphorescent moss. The walls were carved with symbols that hurt my eyes to look at directly. The ceiling stretched up into darkness, supported by pillars that looked like enormous tree roots. And everywhere, moving through the chamber like busy ants, were the Ursenrat, hundreds of them, maybe thousands. They tended gardens of strange mushrooms, crafted tools from bone and stone, painted symbols on the walls with glowing paint. It was a complete civilization, ancient beyond measure, living beneath the Alaskan wilderness. Welcome to the deep places, said the old one, appearing beside me. This is where we have lived since the world was young. I stared in amazement. How many of you are there? Enough to protect what must be protected. But fewer each year. The deep cold times were hard on us. Your people's machines disturb our tunnels. The sacred sites above are all we have left of the old connections. He led me through the chamber to a place where the wall was covered with carvings. They showed the history of the land, ice ages coming and going, the first humans arriving, the building of sacred sites on the surface. For thousands of sacred winters, we lived in balance, the old one said. Your people understood the sacred places. They left offerings, asked permission, treated the ancestor sites with respect. What changed? The gold seekers came. Then the oil seekers. Then the scientists who wanted to dig up the ancestors' bones to study them. Now they come with metal detectors and computers, looking for things to sell. I understood. The Ursenrat weren't evil. They weren't trying to hurt people for fun. They were desperate, fighting a losing battle to protect the last remnants of an ancient world. But that didn't make kidnapping people right. Show me where you're keeping Peters and Kelly, I said. The old one nodded and led me deeper into the complex. We passed through chambers filled with underground streams, rooms where tiny Ursenrat children played games that involved moving stones through complex patterns. Workshops where tools were crafted from materials I couldn't identify. Finally, we reached a comfortable chamber where Dr. Peters and Kelly Martinez sat on soft moss, eating strange fruit and talking quietly. They looked up when they saw me. Dave, Kelly jumped up. Thank God, I thought we were going to die down here. Are you both okay? I asked. Physically, yes, Peter said. They've been very kind, actually. Fed us, given us clean water, shown us some remarkable things, but they won't let us leave. The old Ursanerat looked at me. Now you have seen the deep places. Now you understand what we protect. Will you help us, Ranger Dave? Will you use your authority to truly protect the sacred sites? I thought about it. I could promise anything to get Peters and Kelly free, then worry about the consequences later. But something told me these ancient beings would know if I was lying. I'll try, I said, but I can't do it alone, and I can't do it by keeping people prisoner. Then what do you propose? I took a deep breath. Partnership. You know where all the sacred sites are, but you can't be everywhere at once. I have legal authority in radio communication, but I don't know what I'm protecting. Work with me. Guide me to the places that need protection. Help me understand what I'm looking at. In return, I'll make sure those places get official protection. The old one was quiet for a long moment. Then he said, "And when your laws fail? When the gold seekers come anyway? Then we deal with them together. But give the law a chance to work first." The chamber filled with whispered conversations in rapid Gwich'in. I caught fragments, arguments about trust, about the failure of human promises, about the need to protect the ancestors. Finally, the old one spoke. "We will try this partnership. But if the sacred places are disturbed, if the ancestors are dishonored, the agreement ends. Your people will face our full power." And Peters and Kelly go free? They go free, but they must promise never to use metal detectors or digging tools in this area. They must promise to speak of the sacred sites only to those who will protect them. Peters and Kelly both nodded eagerly. "Then we have a deal," I said. The ground beneath us began to rise, lifting us up through the earth like we were in a natural elevator. Within minutes, we emerged into the forest where our camp had been. The sun was just touching the horizon, real sunset, not the endless twilight of deep summer. Somehow, we'd been underground for hours, but it had felt like minutes. As we walked toward the helicopter landing site, I heard the voices one more time. "Remember your promise, Ranger Dave. The ancestors are watching." The official report said that Dr. Peters and Ranger Martinez had fallen into a natural cave system and gotten lost in the underground passages. Equipment malfunctions had interfered with radio communication. Standard wilderness hazards, nothing more. Emma Thompson was listed as suffering from heat exhaustion and disorientation caused by the midnight sun. Her GPS malfunctions were attributed to unusual magnetic properties in the area, which wasn't entirely untrue. Within 6 months, I had worked with tribal elders to get 17 sites in the Chandalar Valley, officially designated as sacred cultural areas, off-limits to archaeological excavation or metal detecting. I told the Park Service they were important burial grounds that needed protection under federal law. I didn't tell them about the Ursanerat. But the partnership worked. Over the next few years, I learned to recognize the signs when the little people were active. Hikers would report compass problems or GPS malfunctions in certain areas. I'd know to steer search and rescue teams away from the sacred sites and toward places where lost people were likely to be found safe and sound. The Ursanerat kept their word too. People still got confused in the deep forest sometimes, but they were always led to safety. No one else disappeared underground. The tiny footprints appeared now and then, but only around campsites where people had left trash or violated fire restrictions. Dr. Peters became one of my strongest allies in protecting indigenous cultural sites. He never spoke publicly about what happened in the underground chambers, but he helped me identify and protect dozens of other important locations across Alaska. Kelly Martinez transferred to a different park after finishing her training. She said the experience had made her realize she was better suited for work that didn't involve extended time alone in the wilderness. Sometimes she sent me postcards from national parks in the lower 48. Emma Thompson still guides trips through Alaska's wilderness, but she avoids the Chandalar Valley. When people ask why, she just says the area has unusual navigation hazards that make it too dangerous for tourist groups. Sometimes, when I'm alone in the forest on a quiet night, I still hear the voices. They tell me about disturbances in the protected areas, someone camping where they shouldn't, or trying to dig for artifacts. I investigate these reports, and I usually find evidence of the problems they've described. The Ursanerat are still watching, still protecting. But now they're not alone. Last month, a gold prospector was found 60 miles from where he'd entered the wilderness, suffering from what the doctors called severe spatial disorientation. His metal detector had been completely destroyed, not broken, but dissolved, like it had been dunked in acid. He told the investigators that tiny voices had followed him through the forest for days, whispering threats in a language he didn't understand. Every time he'd tried to use his metal detector near what looked like old burial mounds, the device would spark and smoke. Finally, he'd thrown the detector away and hiked out as fast as he could. The man was treated and released. His prospecting permit was revoked for violations of protected area regulations. I never filed a report about voices in the forest or dissolved metal detectors. Some things are better left unexplained, but I keep my promise to the old ones. The sacred places remain protected, the ancestors sleep undisturbed, and the Ursenrat continue their ancient watch over the wilderness. And sometimes, on very quiet nights, when the aurora borealis dances green across the sky, I can hear them singing in the deep places beneath the earth, songs that have been sung since the world was young, songs that keep the balance between the old ways and the new. I'm 58 years old now, still ranging through Alaska's wild places. I've got maybe 7 years left before retirement, maybe 10 if I'm lucky. When that time comes, I'll need to find someone to take over the partnership with the Ursenrat. Someone who understands that there are older laws than the ones written by humans, and deeper responsibilities than the ones listed in any job description. Someone who knows that in the deepest wilderness, we are not the guardians, we are the guests.